The gallows stood stark against the pale morning sky, its wooden frame freshly constructed at the center of Willow Creek's main street. A crowd had gathered despite the early hour, their faces solemn and expectant. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders for a better view, women clutched handkerchiefs to their mouths, and men stood with hats held against their chests. The air hummed with tension as a young man no older than 25 was led up the 13 steps to the platform. Clara Winters stood at the edge of the crowd, her black mourning dress indistinguishable from the shadows cast by the buildings. 2 years of widow's weeds had become her second skin. She watched the proceedings with eyes that betrayed no emotion, yet saw everything. The condemned man's trembling hands, the hangman's mechanical movements, the eager anticipation on some faces, the reluctant duty on others. Sheriff Sullivan stood beside the gallows, his Union cavalry hat pulled low over his weathered face. His left hand rested on the pommel of his revolver, while his right gripped a walking stick, compensating for the pronounced limp, a souvenir from Antietam. The badge on his chest caught the morning light as he shifted his weight uncomfortably. "People of Willow Creek," a commanding voice rang out, silencing the murmurs. Judge Howard stepped forward, a tall figure in a black coat that emphasized his broad shoulders and the silver at his temples. "We gather today to witness justice being served upon Albert Reynolds, found guilty of murder." From his position at the rear of the crowd, Samuel Foster observed without expression. His lean frame was draped in a dust-covered duster, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. One hand remained near the revolver at his hip, a habit born of years of vigilance. His eyes, gray as winter storm clouds, scanned the crowd methodically before settling on Clara's solitary figure. "Let this serve as a reminder," Judge Howard continued, his voice carrying across the assembled townsfolk, "that law and order prevail in Willow Creek. Even in these difficult times after the war, justice will be swift and certain." Standing beside the judge was Gerald Blackwood, the town's storekeeper and most prosperous citizen. Despite the somber occasion, a satisfied smile played at the corners of his mouth. His thumbs, hooked into a brocade vest, stretched tight across his considerable girth gold watch chain, gleaming in the morning sun. The condemned man was given his moment to speak. "I didn't kill him," he insisted, voice breaking. "I found him that way. Please." The hangman slipped the noose over his head, tightening it with practiced efficiency. Clara closed her eyes just before the trapdoor dropped. The sudden crack of rope going taut cut through the collective gasp of the crowd. When she opened them again, the body swung gently in the morning breeze. For a moment, she wasn't in Willow Creek anymore. The field hospital tents flapped in the hot Virginia wind. Blood soaked into the ground beneath her knees as she worked frantically to stem the flow from a young soldier's leg, the tourniquets slick beneath her fingers. All around her, men screamed and wept. The acrid smell of gunpowder mingled with the copper tang of blood and the sickly sweet odor of gangrene. "Hold on," she whispered to the soldier, his face no more than a boy's. "Just hold on." But the blood kept coming too fast, too much. Her hands, once pristine and delicate, now stained crimson to the wrists. Clara blinked the memory away, her face betraying nothing of the storm within. As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring among themselves, she turned to leave. Her path inadvertently crossed with Samuel Foster's. For a brief moment, their eyes met hers, empty of emotion, his filled with something she couldn't name. Recognition, perhaps. Not of her face, but of something deeper. The look of someone who had seen too much death to be moved by one more. She looked away, first adjusting her black shawl around her shoulders, and continued her solitary walk home. Behind her, Samuel watched her go, his attention drawn away only when Gerald Blackwood's booming voice rose above the dissipating crowd. "A drink to justice served," Gerald called to his companions, clapping Judge Howard on the back. "First round at Mason's is on me." Samuel's jaw tightened as he observed the two men flanked by several of the town's more prosperous citizens making their way toward the saloon. His hand absently touched a folded telegram in his pocket, a message that had brought him to this dying mining town in the first place. "Find the missing men. Follow the Blackwood Trail. Trust no one." Clara's cabin stood a quarter-mile outside Willow Creek proper, partially hidden by a stand of juniper trees. Once the small homestead had been well-maintained, white-painted fence, thriving garden, neat shingled roof. Now the fence peeled and sagged, the garden lay fallow, and several shingles had worked loose during the previous winter's storms. Inside, Clara moved with quiet efficiency, stoking the fire in the hearth and setting water to boil for tea. The cabin's single room was clean, but spare a bed with a handmade quilt, a table with two chairs, a rocking chair beside the hearth, and shelves holding the few possessions she'd managed to keep. On the highest shelf, gathering dust, sat a wooden box. It was crafted of oak with brass hinges and a simple latch. She glanced at it briefly before turning away as she did every morning. Some habits, even painful ones, were hard to break. The kettle's whistle pierced the silence. As she prepared her tea, a knock at the door made her pause. Few visitors came this far from town, and fewer still were welcome. Mrs. Winters, Gerald Blackwood's voice carried through the wooden door. "I know you're in there." Clara's shoulders stiffened. She set down her cup and smoothed her skirt before opening the door just wide enough to see her visitor. Gerald Blackwood stood on her porch, his bulk filling the doorframe. Despite the chill, spring morning sweat beaded on his forehead beneath a bowler hat too small for his round face. "Mr. Blackwood," she acknowledged, her voice neutral. "What brings you out this way?" "Business, Mrs. Winters. Always business." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "May I come in?" She hesitated, then stepped back, allowing him entry. Gerald cast an appraising look around the cabin, noting the worn furniture and simple furnishings with poorly disguised satisfaction. "Tea," she offered, more from ingrained courtesy than hospitality. "Don't bother," he replied, removing his hat. "I won't be staying long." Clara remained standing, unwilling to invite him to sit. "What business brings you here today?" Gerald reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small notebook. "Your husband's debt." He flipped through the pages with thick fingers. "With interest, you now owe $217. Payment is due by the end of the month." Clara's face remained impassive, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "You know I don't have that kind of money, Mr. Blackwood." "Indeed." His smile widened, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Which is why I've come to offer an alternative arrangement." "I'm not interested in alternative arrangements," Clara replied, her voice cooling further. Gerald's expression hardened. "You don't have many options, Mrs. Winters. This cabin sits on land that could be valuable to the right buyer. The railroad might be coming through. This land belonged to James's family. I won't give it up. Then perhaps there's something else of value you could offer." His gaze traveled slowly from her face downward, the implication unmistakable. Clara's hand instinctively moved to the knife she kept in her pocket, a habit from her days as a field nurse, when not all dangers came from the enemy lines. Gerald noticed the movement and chuckled. "Always the fighter, aren't you? Your husband mentioned that about you, said it was what he loved most." He stepped closer, his bulk intimidating in the small cabin. "But James isn't here to protect you anymore, is he?" "I don't need protection, Mr. Blackwood, especially not from a man like you." Gerald's face flushed with anger. "You'd do well to watch your tone, woman. I own half the debts in this town. People who cross me tend to regret it." "Is that what happened to Albert Reynolds?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Something dangerous flashed in Gerald's eyes. "Reynolds was a thief and a murderer. He got what he deserved." He reached into his pocket again, this time withdrawing a silver pocket watch. "Speaking of getting what one deserves," Clara's breath caught. "That's James's watch." "Indeed it is." Gerald dangled it before her, the inscription on its case catching the firelight. "Time heals all wounds, but love transcends time." Quite poetic. James pawned it to me before his unfortunate accident. Clara reached for it, but Gerald pulled it back, tucking it into his vest pocket. "This could be yours again, part of our alternative arrangement." Before she could respond, another knock came at the door. Gerald scowled at the interruption. Clara opened the door to find Sheriff Sullivan standing on her porch, hat in hand. His gray hair was neatly combed, his weathered face composed into an expression of polite inquiry. "Morning, Mrs. Winters," he said, nodding respectfully. Then, noticing Gerald inside, "Blackwood, didn't expect to find you out here." "Me, I just collecting on debts, Sheriff." Gerald's tone was suddenly jovial. "Someone has to keep this town's finances in order." Sullivan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is that so?" He turned back to Clara. "Just came to check if you needed anything from town, Mrs. Winters. Dr. Williams mentioned you might be running low on some supplies." "That's very kind, Sheriff, but I'm fine," Clara replied, grateful for the interruption despite her confusion at his sudden appearance. Gerald replaced his hat, brushing past Sullivan. End of the month, Mrs. Winters. We'll continue our discussion then. He tipped his hat with mock courtesy. Sheriff, they watched as Gerald made his way down the path toward town, his broad back straight, with indignation at being interrupted. You all right, Clara? Sullivan asked once Gerald was out of earshot, his formality dropping away. It was the first time he'd used her given name. I'm fine, she replied automatically. Sullivan's lined face crinkled with concern. Gerald Blackwood's not a man to cross. If he's giving you trouble, with all due respect, Sheriff, I've handled worse than Gerald Blackwood. Clara's voice was steady but firm. I appreciate your concern, but it's unnecessary. Sullivan studied her for a long moment. James made me promise to look after you if anything happened to him, he said finally. I haven't done a very good job of it these past 2 years. Clara's composure faltered briefly at the mention of her husband. You were James's godfather, not his keeper, and you're certainly not mine. Sullivan nodded, accepting her rebuke. Just the same, be careful around Blackwood. He's not what he seems. He replaced his hat. Good day, Mrs. Winters. Clara watched him limp back toward town, leaning heavily on his walking stick. Only when he was gone did she close the door and lean against it, her calm facade crumbling. She crossed to the hearth and sank into the rocking chair, her hand reaching for a ghost, the warmth of James's hand on her shoulder. The sound of his voice reading aloud in the evenings, the sight of his smile across the breakfast table. All gone now, washed away in a flood 2 years ago, leaving nothing but memories and debts. Her gaze drifted to the wooden box on the high shelf. With sudden determination, she stood and retrieved it, setting it carefully on the table. The latch was stiff from disuse. Inside, nestled in compartments lined with faded velvet, lay the tools of her former calling: scalpels, forceps, scissors, needles, and thread for suturing. A small bottle of laudanum, half empty, rolls of clean bandages. Clara lifted a scalpel, its blade still sharp despite years of neglect. She ran her thumb along the edge, remembering how it had felt to make that first incision to cut away damaged flesh to save the whole, to heal instead of harm. With gentle reverence, she removed the instruments one by one, wiping away the dust with a clean cloth. Then just as carefully, she replaced each item and closed the box, returning it to its shelf. Not yet. She wasn't ready to be that woman again. Not yet. The Rusty Nails saloon hummed with midday activity, the clinking of glasses and murmur of conversation, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter. Samuel Foster sat alone at a corner table nursing a whiskey he had no intention of finishing. His back was to the wall, giving him a clear view of the entrance and most of the room. The bartender, a burly man with a thick mustache and a missing ear, eyed Samuel suspiciously. Strangers weren't uncommon in Willow Creek, but ones who nursed a single drink for hours while watching everyone else were cause for concern. At the bar, 3 men huddled in conversation, occasionally glancing towards Samuel. From their faded blue shirts and the way they clustered together, Samuel identified them as former Union soldiers, likely from the same unit. The war had ended 7 years ago, but in towns like Willow Creek, the divisions remained. The saloon doors swung open, admitting Sheriff Sullivan. The conversations dimmed momentarily before resuming at a lower volume. Sullivan surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on Samuel before he approached the bar. Whiskey Tom, he said to the bartender. The decent kind. As the bartender poured, Sullivan casually made his way to Samuel's table. Without invitation, he pulled out a chair and sat, placing his drink and his walking stick on the table. Don't recall seeing you at the hanging this morning. Sullivan said, his tone conversational but his eyes sharp. I was there, Samuel replied. Just prefer to keep my distance from crowds. Sullivan nodded as if this confirmed something. Got a name, stranger? Samuel Foster. What brings you to Willow Creek, Mr. Foster? We're not exactly on the main trail. Samuel took a measured sip of his whiskey. Just passing through, looking for work. What kind of work? Whatever's available. I'm handy with tools, good with horses. He met Sullivan's gaze evenly. Served in the war. Learned to make do. A flicker of recognition crossed Sullivan's face. Which regiment? 2nd Massachusetts, Upo Fort T, Brooklyn. The 2 men regarded each other with newfound awareness. Both had stood on the blood-soaked field of Antietam, though on different parts of the line. You were there, Sullivan said quietly. September 62. Samuel nodded, once his expression unchanged, but something darkening in his eyes. I was. Thought you looked familiar. Something about the way you carry yourself. Sullivan took a drink. Though most men from that day don't live to grow older. No, Samuel agreed, they don't. A heavy silence fell between them, filled with unspoken memories of a day when over 20,000 men fell dead or wounded in the space of a few hours, still the bloodiest single day in American history. Sullivan broke the silence first. Town's got little work to offer these days. Mine's played out 3 years back, folks hanging on by their fingernails. He studied Samuel over the rim of his glass. Though Gerald Blackwood always seems to be hiring strong backs for his lumber operation north of town, Samuel's face betrayed nothing at the mention of Blackwood's name. I'll keep that in mind. You do that. Sullivan finished his drink and stood retrieving his walking stick. Word of advice, Foster. Willow Creek ain't fond of mysteries. Whatever you're really doing here, keep it simple and keep it quiet. He tipped his hat slightly. Good day to you. Samuel watched the sheriff limp away, noting how conversations resumed their normal volume once the lawman had departed. He remained at his table for another hour, observing the ebb and flow of patrons, listening to fragments of conversation, building a mental map of the town's dynamics. By mid-afternoon, he'd learned that Gerald Blackwood held mortgages on half the businesses in town that Judge Howard visited from the county seat once a month to hold court, and that a woman named Clara Winters was considered both respected and pitiable, a war nurse turned widow who kept to herself these days. The same woman he'd seen at the hanging, the one with dead eyes and ramrod posture that spoke of someone holding themselves together through sheer force of will. Samuel left a coin on the table and stepped into the harsh afternoon sunlight. He paused on the boardwalk, adjusting his hat against the glare, and surveyed the town's main street. Willow Creek had the look of a place that had known better days, faded paint, loose boards. Businesses closed and boarded up. Only Gerald Blackwood's general store showed signs of prosperity, its windows clean, its wares plentiful behind the glass. As Samuel watched Clara Winters emerge from the store, a small basket clutched in her hands. Her black dress and shawl stood out starkly against the dusty street. Gerald Blackwood followed her to the door, his voice carrying across the street. Remember our conversation, Mrs. Winters. End of the month. Clara gave no indication she'd heard him, continuing her steady pace down the boardwalk. As she passed the saloon, one of the former Union men Samuel had observed earlier stepped into her path. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice slurred with drink. "Don't think rebel widows ought to be using the same boardwalk as loyal Union folk." Clara attempted to step around him, but the man moved to block her again. "Did you hear me, rebel woman? Your kind lost the war. About time you remembered it." Samuel tensed his hand, instinctively moving toward his revolver. Before he could intervene, however, Sheriff Sullivan appeared, placing himself between Clara and the drunk. "That's enough, Miller," he said firmly. "Go sleep it off." "Ah, Sheriff, just having some fun," Miller protested, swaying slightly. "Everyone knows her husband fought for the rebels before coming north. Probably a spattor. James Winters fought for the Union, you fool," Sullivan corrected, his voice hardening. "He served with distinction at Chancellorsville. Now go on home before I decide you need a night in my jail to cool off." Miller muttered something under his breath but shuffled away, casting a resentful glance at Clara. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said quietly, "but that wasn't necessary." "It was, and you know it." Sullivan's voice was gentler now. "Town's on edge with the drought and the railroad rumors. People looking for someone to blame." He glanced at Samuel, who still stood observing from outside the saloon. "Go on home, Clara. I'll have one of the boys bring your supplies out later." She nodded, clutching her basket tighter, and continued down the street. Samuel watched her go, noting the rigid line of her back, the careful precision of her steps. A woman holding herself together with iron discipline. Later that evening, as dusk settled over Willow Creek, Samuel made his way to the small church at the edge of town. The building stood abandoned, its steeple damaged in a storm. Years earlier, its windows broken and boarded up. He slipped inside through a side door, moving silently through the musty interior to a small room at the back that had once served as the pastor's study. There, by the light of a single candle, he extracted a small leather journal from his inside pocket and began to write, his pencil scratching softly against the paper. April 15, 1872. Arrived in Willow Creek. GB, as suspected, is prominent citizen, owns general store, and has financial hold over much of town. Sheriff Sullivan, former Union wounded at Antietam, seems to know more than he lets on. Observed GB pressuring Clara Winter's widow, former nurse. Connection to investigation unclear but worth watching. Hanging this morning, young man named Reynolds. Convicted of murder, protested innocence to the end. Judge Howard presided, seemed unusually close with GB. 7 Union veterans confirmed missing in last 18 months from surrounding counties. No bodies recovered. Need to verify if pattern extends to Confederate veterans as well. Sarah's trail leads here. I can feel it. This time I won't be too late. He closed the journal and extinguished the candle, sitting in darkness as rain began to patter against the church's broken windows. The storm that had threatened all day was finally breaking. Samuel had weathered worse. The downpour intensified as night fell, turning Willow Creek's dirt streets to mud. Clara stood at her cabin window watching lightning flash across the sky. The roof leaked in 3 places, tin buckets positioned to catch the drips. The steady ping of water against metal created an arrhythmic counterpoint to the drumming of rain on the roof. She had just settled into her rocking chair with a book when a pounding at her door startled her. Cautiously, she reached for the rifle she kept beside the door before opening it a crack. Gerald Blackwood stood on her porch, rain dripping from his hat brim, his face contorted with barely controlled rage. Behind him, 2 men waited in the downpour, their faces shadowed under rain-soaked hats. "Mrs. Winters," Gerald's voice was dangerously calm. "We need to conclude our business tonight." Clara kept the rifle hidden behind the door. "It's late, Mr. Blackwood, and as I told you this morning, I don't have your money." "I'm not here for money." Gerald's hand shot out, shoving the door wider. "I'm here for payment in kind." Clara brought the rifle up, but Gerald was faster than his bulk suggested. He knocked it from her hands and grabbed her wrist, pulling her out onto the porch. "No one can hear you scream out here," he hissed, his breath hot against her face, reeking of whiskey. "You've been avoiding me long enough." Clara struggled, but his grip was like iron. "Let me go, or I swear." "You'll what?" Gerald laughed, a sound like gravel underfoot. "There's no one to help you. No one ever does." As he dragged her down the porch steps into the muddy yard, Clara fought with desperate intensity, years of nursing having taught her human vulnerabilities. She drove her knee upward, aiming for his groin, but one of Gerald's companions intervened, grabbing her other arm. "Hold her still," Gerald commanded, his face twisted with cruel anticipation. "Mrs. Winters needs to learn her place in this town." Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in stark white light. In that instant, Clara saw a figure emerge from the darkness, moving with the silent grace of a predator. Before she could process what was happening, Gerald's companion was sprawled in the mud, clutching his throat and gasping for air. Gerald spun around, still gripping Clara's wrist. "Who the hell?" Samuel Foster stood before them, rain cascading off his hat brim. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes reflecting the lightning like some vengeful spirit. "Let her go, dear," he said, his voice barely audible above the storm, yet carrying a threat more potent than a shout. Gerald released Clara's wrist, shoving her aside as he faced this new threat. "This ain't your business, mister." "I'm making it my business." Samuel didn't raise his voice, didn't reach for his weapon. He simply stood waiting, a coiled spring, ready to release. Gerald, emboldened by whiskey and the presence of his remaining companion, lunged forward, throwing a wild punch. Samuel sidestepped with fluid ease, delivering a precise strike to Gerald's kidney that dropped the larger man to his knees in the mud. The second man drew a knife, slashing at Samuel with panicked desperation. Samuel caught his wrist, twisting until the knife fell from nerveless fingers, then delivered a short, brutal blow to the man's temple. He collapsed beside Gerald, unconscious. Gerald struggled to his feet, mud-soaked and furious. "You've made a mistake, stranger. A big one." He backed away, dragging his unconscious companion. "This ain't over." "It is for tonight," Samuel replied, his stance making it clear he wouldn't allow further aggression. With a final venomous glare, Gerald retreated into the darkness, the sound of his squelching footsteps gradually fading into the night. Samuel turned to Clara, who stood shivering in the rain, her black dress plastered to her body. Without a word, he removed his duster and draped it around her shoulders, its length enormous on her smaller frame. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice gentler now. Clara shook her head, water streaming down her face, rain or tears impossible to tell in the darkness. "Who are you?" "Samuel Foster. We should get inside. You're freezing." He led her back to the cabin, his hand hovering near her elbow, but not quite touching her, respecting her space while offering support if needed. Inside, he moved with unexpected efficiency, stoking the fire to a blaze, while Clara changed behind a screen in the corner, exchanging her soaked dress for a dry nightgown and robe. When she emerged, Samuel was hanging his wet hat and vest near the fire. He'd positioned a chair for her close to the hearth. "Sit," he said, not an order but a gentle suggestion. "I'll make tea." Clara watched in bemusement as this stranger navigated her small kitchen, finding kettle and cups as if he'd been there before. "You didn't answer my question," she said, wrapping her robe tighter around herself. "Who are you, really?" Samuel set the kettle on the stove before turning to face her. "Just a man passing through." "Men passing through don't intervene in local disputes, especially not with Gerald Blackwood." A ghost of a smile touched Samuel's lips. "Perhaps I have a particular dislike for bullies." "It's more than that." Clara studied him with the assessing eye of a nurse who had learned to read men quickly on the battlefield. "You knew who he was. You were watching him. Watching me." Samuel considered her for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal. "You're observant, Mrs. Winters." "I was a nurse during the war. Observation kept men alive." She accepted the cup of tea he offered. "And it's Clara. After what just happened, I think we can dispense with formalities." Samuel nodded, taking the chair opposite her. "Fair enough, Clara. You still haven't answered my question." "No," he agreed. "I haven't." They sat in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the persistent drumming of rain on the roof. Clara sipped her tea, studying Samuel over the rim of her cup. In the firelight, she could see his features more clearly, a face weathered by sun and wind, eyes that had seen too much a scar that ran along his jawline, partially hidden by his beard. Not handsome in the conventional sense, but compelling in his quiet intensity. "You were at the hanging this morning," she said finally. Samuel raised an eyebrow. "You noticed me?" "I notice everything." Clara set down her cup. "Just as you noticed Gerald Blackwood's particular interest in me." "Hard to miss." Samuel leaned forward, in his forearms resting on his knees. "What does he want from you besides the obvious?" Clara hesitated, then decided this man had earned a measure of truth. "My husband borrowed money from him before he died. I've been working to pay it back, but the debt never seems to get smaller." "And there's something else," Samuel prompted, his perception uncomfortably accurate. "A pocket watch, silver with an inscription. It was a Whitley family heirloom. James pawned it to Gerald before he died in the flood 2 years ago. I've been trying to redeem it." "Time heals all wounds, but love transcends time," Samuel said softly. Clara's head snapped up. "How do you know that?" Samuel's expression gave nothing away. Just a common saying. But Clara wasn't fooled. The inscription had been unique, crafted specifically for James's great-grandparents on their wedding day. No one in Willow Creek would know those words except Gerald, and now, somehow, Samuel Foster. Before she could press him further, a particularly loud thunderclap shook the cabin, making the windows rattle in their frames. The storm was directly overhead now, its fury unabated. "You should stay," Clara said, surprising herself with the offer. "At least until the storm passes." Samuel shook his head. "I've imposed enough." "It's not an imposition. It's practical." Clara gestured to the deluge visible through the window. "And after what you did tonight, I owe you." "You don't owe me anything," Samuel replied, his voice firm. "What Gerald Blackwood was trying to do." He trailed off, a flash of something dark crossing his features. "No one deserves that, duh." Clara studied him for a moment longer, then nodded toward a chest in the corner. "There are blankets in there. You can sleep by the fire." Her voice softened slightly. "I'd rest easier knowing you were here in case Gerald decides to return with more men." Samuel seemed about to refuse again, then reconsidered. "All right, just until morning." As Clara prepared for bed, then she watched Samuel arrange the blankets on the floor near the hearth. There was something both reassuring and unsettling about his presence, a stranger who had protected her without hesitation, yet clearly harbored secrets of his own. "Thank you," she said softly as she slipped behind the privacy screen to her bed, "for intervening tonight." "Try to sleep, Clara," Samuel replied, settling onto his makeshift bed. "I'll keep watch." And strangely, despite the storm raging outside and the events of the night, Clara found herself drifting into the most peaceful sleep she'd known in 2 years. In that space between wakefulness and dreams, a thought surfaced, both troubling and oddly comforting. Samuel Foster was dangerous, but not to her. Dawn broke clear and crisp, the storm having scrubbed the air clean. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of someone moving quietly about her cabin. For a disorienting moment, she thought it was James, his familiar morning routine of stoking the fire and brewing coffee before she rose. Reality returned with a pang of grief, not James, Samuel Foster. She dressed quickly behind the privacy screen and emerged to find Samuel at the stove, his back to her. He'd folded the blankets neatly and returned them to the chest. Nothing in the cabin suggested a man had spent the night save for the fresh coffee and the lingering sense of a protective presence. "You're still here," she observed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Samuel turned, offering a cup of coffee. "Said I'd stay until morning." Clara accepted the cup, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "Thank you." They sat at the small table, a comfortable silence settling between them. Through the window, Clara could see the damage from last night's storm branches down her garden, muddy and battered. The fence she'd been meaning to repair had collapsed entirely on one side. "Your roof leaks in 3 places," Samuel said, following her gaze. "And that north-facing window won't last another winter." Clara sipped her coffee. "I'm aware. I could fix them. The roof, the window, the fence too." She studied him over the rim of her cup. "Why would you do that?" "I need work. You need repairs." Samuel shrugged as if it were that simple. "And I suspect Gerald Blackwood won't take last night's interruption lightly. Having a reason to be here might discourage further visits." Clara considered his offer. On one hand, accepting help from this stranger felt dangerous in ways she couldn't quite articulate. On the other, her practical side recognized the sense in what he proposed. "I can't pay you much," she said finally. "Barely enough for materials." "I don't need much." Samuel's gaze met hers, direct and unflinching. "Just a place to stay while I'm in Willow Creek. Meals included." Clara raised an eyebrow. "And how long do you plan to stay in Willow Creek, Mr. Foster?" "Samuel," he corrected. "And I'm not sure yet. Depends on how things develop." "What things?" The ghost of a smile touched his lips again. "You ask a lot of questions, Clara, and you answer very few of them." He acknowledged this with a slight nod. "Fair enough. Let's just say I have business that may take some time to conclude." Clara set down her cup with a decisive click. "If you're going to stay in my home and eat at my table, I need more than cryptic half-answers, Samuel. Who are you really? What brings you to Willow Creek? And why are you so interested in Gerald Blackwood?" Samuel was silent for a long moment, weighing his response. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice lowered, though there was no one to overhear them. "What I'm about to tell you puts you at risk. Are you certain you want to know?" Clara didn't hesitate. "Yes." Samuel studied her face as if gauging her resolve. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him. "I work for the Pinkerton Detective Agency," he said finally. "I've been tracking a network of criminals across 3 territories. Men who traffic in human lives, particularly young women and former soldiers who've fallen on hard times." Clara's face remained composed, though her hands tightened around her coffee cup. "And you believe Gerald Blackwood is part of this network?" Samuel nodded. "Not just part of it, a key figure in this region, along with his brother Nathaniel and a man named Judge Howard." "Judge Howard," Clara couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. "He's the most respected man in the county." "Respect can be a useful cover for corruption," Samuel replied grimly, "especially in isolated communities like this one." Clara absorbed this information, her mind working quickly. "The young man who was hanged yesterday, Reynolds. You think he was innocent?" "I think he discovered something he shouldn't have, and paid the price for it." A chill ran through Clara despite the morning warmth. "These missing soldiers you mentioned, who are they?" "Union veterans, mostly men who served with distinction but struggled after the war. Men without family connections, drifting from town to town looking for work." Samuel's expression darkened. "They disappear without a trace. No bodies, no witnesses. Just gone. And you think they're being, what, killed? Some perhaps, others forced into labor camps in the territories or sold to mining operations. Men with military training are valuable in certain markets." Clara set down her cup, her appetite gone. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Gerald Blackwood has been watching you for 2 years, waiting for the right moment." Samuel's gaze was intense. "Your continued resistance has made you a challenge. Men like Gerald enjoy breaking strong spirits." The implication was clear. Had Samuel not intervened last night, Clara might have become another victim, not just of assault, but potentially of this larger criminal enterprise. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "For now, nothing." Samuel stood carrying his cup to the basin. "Just a chance to keep an eye on Blackwood while I gather evidence, and maybe fix your roof in the process." Clara studied him, this strange, dangerous man who had appeared in her life like a storm on the horizon. Logic told her to send him away to distance herself from whatever darkness he carried. But instinct, the same instinct that had guided her decisions on blood-soaked battlefields, told her Samuel Foster might be her best chance at survival. "The tools are in the shed out back," she said finally. "I'll show you what needs fixing." As they stepped outside into the clear morning light, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that she had just made a decision that would irrevocably change the course of her life. For better or worse remained to be seen. Samuel worked methodically through the morning, patching the roof where it leaked, securing loose boards, and reinforcing the sagging fence. Clara busied herself in what remained of her garden, clearing debris from the storm and assessing what might be salvaged. By midday, they had fallen into an unexpectedly comfortable rhythm, working separately yet aware of each other's movements, occasionally exchanging practical comments about the repairs or the weather. It felt strangely domestic, a simulacrum of normal life that Clara had not experienced since James's death. As Samuel hammered the last post of the fence into place, Sheriff Sullivan approached on horseback, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. He reined in at the edge of the property, observing them for a moment before dismounting with some difficulty favoring his bad leg. "Mrs. Winters," he called, approaching the fence line. "Foster." Clara straightened from her gardening, brushing dirt from her hands. "Sheriff, what brings you out this way?" "Checking on folks after the storm," Sullivan replied, though his gaze remained fixed on Samuel. "Didn't expect to find company out here." "Mr. Foster is helping with some repairs," Clara explained, moving to stand beside Samuel. "The storm did considerable damage." Sullivan's weathered face creased in a frown. "Is that so?" He turned to Samuel. "Mighty neighborly of you, Foster, considering you just arrived in town." Samuel set down his hammer. "Mrs. Winters needed help. I needed work." "Simple as that, huh?" Sullivan's tone made it clear he didn't believe it for a moment. "Funny thing, though. Had a visit from Gerald Blackwood this morning. Seems he had some trouble out this way last night." Clara tensed, but Samuel's expression remained neutral. "What kind of trouble?" "Says he came to discuss business with Mrs. Winters when he was attacked by a stranger." "Unprovoked." Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "That stranger wouldn't happen to be you, would it, Foster?" "If defending a woman from assault is trouble, then yes, I was involved," Samuel replied evenly. Sullivan's gaze shifted to Clara. "That true, Mrs. Winters, was Blackwood assaulting you?" Clara lifted her chin slightly. "He and two other men came here in the night uninvited. When I refused their business proposition, Gerald became insistent. Mr. Foster intervened. I believe he saved me from serious harm." The sheriff absorbed this information, his expression softening slightly. "I see." He turned back to Samuel. "You should know, Foster, that Gerald Blackwood isn't a man to cross lightly. He has friends in high places." "So I've heard," Samuel replied, "including Judge Howard." Something flickered in Sullivan's eyes, surprise perhaps, or confirmation of a suspicion. "You seem to have learned a lot about our town in a very short time." "I'm observant." "So am I." Sullivan adjusted his stance, leaning more heavily on his good leg. "And what I observe is a stranger taking an unusual interest in both our most prominent citizen and a widow who lives alone." His gaze hardened. "That makes me curious, Foster. Very curious indeed." Samuel met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "Just earning my keep, Sheriff. Nothing more." Sullivan clearly didn't believe him, but seemed to decide against pressing further, at least for now. He turned back to Clara. "If Blackwood or his men bother you again, you send word to me immediately." His voice carried an authority that brooked no argument. "I may not move as fast as I once did, but I can still uphold the law in this town." "Thank you, Sheriff," Clara replied, though her tone suggested she was humoring him rather than accepting his protection. Sullivan nodded once, then made his way back to his horse, mounting with the careful movements of a man accustomed to working around his limitations. Before riding away, he fixed Samuel with a final pointed look. "I'll be watching you, Foster. Remember that." They watched him ride back toward town, dust rising from his horse's hooves in the noon sun. "He knows more than he's saying," Samuel observed quietly. Clara nodded. Sullivan was James's godfather, fought for the Union while James's family supported the Confederacy. It created complications during the war. Yet he seems protective of you. He made a promise to James. Clara turned back to her garden, kneeling to pull weeds with renewed vigor. Sullivan takes his promises seriously, even if he couldn't prevent James's death. Samuel watched her for a moment, noting the tension in her shoulders, the aggressive precision with which she attacked the weeds. "You don't entirely trust him," he observed. Clara paused, a clump of dandelion clutched in her fist. "I don't entirely trust anyone, Mr. Foster. Not anymore." The simple honesty of her statement hung in the air between them, a testament to whatever had hardened this woman's heart against the world. Samuel recognized the sentiment all too well, the same wary isolation that had guided his own existence since the war, since Sarah. Without another word, he returned to his repairs, leaving Clara to her garden and her thoughts. Some wounds couldn't be healed by conversation, only by time, and perhaps, if one was fortunate, by purpose. By dusk, the cabin looked considerably improved. The fence stood straight, the roof no longer leaked, and the north-facing window had been resealed against the coming winter. Samuel had even repaired the porch steps that had begun to rot from years of rain and neglect. Clara prepared a simple dinner: beans, cornbread, and the last of her preserved peaches. They ate in relative silence, both tired from the day's labor, yet somehow comfortable in each other's presence. As Samuel washed the dishes, a task he had assumed without discussion, Clara found herself studying him with growing curiosity. This man was a contradiction, capable of violence, yet gentle in his everyday movements, guarded in his words, yet expressive in his actions. A dangerous man, certainly, but dangerous to whom, and for what purpose, remained unclear. "You play an instrument," she said suddenly, the observation escaping before she could consider it. Samuel turned a plate in his hands, genuine surprise on his face. "How did you know that?" Clara nodded toward his hands. "The calluses on your fingertips, different from labor calluses. My father played violin. He had similar marks." Samuel set the plate down carefully. "Violin," he confirmed, "though it's been some time since I played regularly. The war, among other things." Clara sensed he wouldn't elaborate, so she changed the subject. "Tomorrow I need to go into town for supplies. Will you come with me?" Samuel dried his hands on a towel. "Are you asking for protection or supervision?" "Perhaps both," Clara admitted. "Gerald Blackwood wanted to be pleased to see me after last night, and I suspect you wouldn't mind a closer look at his store." A hint of admiration crossed Samuel's features. "You're quite perceptive, Mrs. Winters." "Clara," she corrected. "And yes, I am. It kept men alive during the war." She stood smoothing her skirt. "Will you come?" Samuel considered her for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, but we should leave early before the store gets busy." Clara agreed, bidding him good night before retreating behind her privacy screen. Samuel made his bed by the hearth again, staring into the dying embers, as Clara's breathing eventually deepened into sleep. Only then did he retrieve his journal from his pack, writing by the faint glow of the coals. April 16, 1872. Confirmed GB's involvement in trafficking. Attempted to force Clara Winters last night. Intervention necessary. Sheriff Sullivan appears suspicious, but not hostile. Possible ally. Need to verify his connection to Judge Howard. Clara Winters more observant than anticipated. Shared limited details of investigation. Risk, but potentially valuable. She has reason to oppose Blackwood. Could provide access to information otherwise difficult to obtain. Tomorrow, reconnaissance of GB's store. Look for evidence of communication with Brother Nathaniel or Judge Howard. Financial records would be ideal, but unlikely to be accessible. Need to locate abandoned church mentioned in Marshall Collins's telegram. Possible drop point for victims before transport. He closed the journal, tucking it away in his pack before stretching out on the blankets. The floor was hard, but Samuel had slept in far worse conditions. What kept him awake wasn't physical discomfort, but the weight of responsibility for his mission for the missing men, and now, unexpectedly, for the widow whose home he shared. Samuel had long ago learned to function on minimal sleep, his rest fragmented by nightmares of Antietam, of Sarah, of faces both remembered and imagined. Tonight was no different. He dozed fitfully, one part of his mind always alert for danger, for the sound of approaching horses, or the creak of the porch steps. By dawn, he was already awake, stoking the fire and brewing coffee as Clara stirred behind her screen. Another day of this strange domestic arrangement that was both cover and, he had to admit, unexpectedly comfortable. Samuel pushed the thought aside. Comfort was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when so many lives hung in the balance. Not when Sarah's memory demanded justice. He had a job to do in Willow Creek. Nothing, not Gerald Blackwood's threats, not Sheriff Sullivan's suspicions, and certainly not Clara Winter's perceptive gaze would deter him from completing it. The morning sun cast long shadows as Clara and Samuel made their way toward Willow Creek. They walked side by side, not speaking, each lost in private thoughts. Clara had exchanged her widow's black for a simple blue dress, the first time in 2 years she'd worn anything but morning colors. The change felt significant, though she couldn't have explained why. Samuel maintained a vigilant silence, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. His revolver hung visibly at his hip, a clear message to anyone who might consider approaching them. As they neared town, the abandoned church came into view. Its weathered spire leaned slightly, as if tired of pointing heavenward. Broken windows gaped like missing teeth in an otherwise dignified face. "Wait," Samuel said, pausing at the overgrown path that led to the church. "I need to check something." Clara followed him up the weed-choked steps. The church doors hung crookedly on rusted hinges, creaking in protest as Samuel pushed them open. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of colored light that filtered through the few remaining stained glass windows. "What are we looking for?" Clara asked, her voice hushed in the cavernous space. Samuel didn't answer immediately, moving purposefully toward the altar area, where a wooden pulpit still stood, its once fine carvings now dulled by time and neglect. He examined the floor, brushing away decades of dust with his boot. "Here," he said, finally indicating faint scratches in the floorboards. Signs of recent movement, heavy objects being dragged. Clara knelt beside him, running her fingers over the marks. Could be anything, animals, children playing, or people being held before transport. Samuel's expression darkened. The telegram mentioned this church as a possible holding location. "Telegram?" Samuel hesitated, then reached into his pocket and extracted a folded paper. "From Marshal Collins, my superior at Pinkerton." Clara read it quickly, her eyes widening at the detailed information about Gerald Blackwood, his brother Nathaniel, and the trafficking operation they ran. 7 Union veterans, she murmured, reading the list of missing men. All from this region, all in the past 18 months. She looked up at Samuel. "And you believe they were held here, in our church?" "Temporarily," Samuel replied, continuing his examination of the space, "before being moved elsewhere, likely at night when the town sleeps." Clara felt a chill despite the morning warmth. The thought of men, perhaps men she had nursed during the war, being held prisoner in a house of worship was profoundly disturbing. As she turned to survey the rest of the church, something caught her eye, a door partially hidden behind the pulpit. "What's through there?" Samuel followed her gaze. "Let's find out." The door opened to a small room, likely once used for private prayer or pastoral counseling. Dust lay thick on the floor, except for a clear path to a large object covered by a tarp in the corner. Samuel approached, cautiously drawing back the covering to reveal an upright piano. "Strange," Clara said, moving closer. "Everything of value was removed from the church years ago when the congregation disbanded. Why leave this?" Samuel ran his hand over the yellowed keys, pressing one experimentally. The note rang out surprisingly clear despite years of neglect. "It's been tuned recently," he observed, pressing another key. "Within the last month, I'd guess." Clara watched as his fingers moved tentatively over the keyboard, picking out a simple melody. "You play piano as well as violin?" Samuel nodded, his expression distant. "My mother taught me, before the war." Without seeming to realize what he was doing, Samuel settled onto the bench and began to play in earnest. The music started softly, a mournful melody that seemed to give voice to the abandoned church's loneliness. Then it grew, becoming something deeper, richer, a piece that spoke of loss, but also of endurance. Clara stood transfixed. In the dusty light of the abandoned church, Samuel Foster was transformed. The hardness left his face, replaced by an expression of such naked emotion that she felt like an intruder witnessing something intensely private. The final notes lingered in the air, fading slowly into silence. Only then did Samuel seem to remember where he was, his hands stilling on the keys, his shoulders tensing as his guard reasserted itself. Chopin, Clara said softly. Nocturne in E-flat major. Samuel glanced up, surprise flickering across his features. You know it. My father played it often. She moved closer, her hand hovering near his shoulder but not quite touching. You play beautifully. Not anymore. Samuel rose abruptly from the bench, putting distance between them. Not since Gettysburg. The mention of that battle, the bloodiest of the war, where over 50,000 men had fallen, hung in the air between them. Clara knew better than to press for the details. She'd treated too many veterans, seen too many haunted eyes to demand explanations for the ghosts they carried. We should continue to town. Samuel said, his voice returned to its usual measured tone. Before the store gets busy. As they turned to leave, Clara noticed a small object partially hidden beneath the piano bench. She knelt to retrieve it, a hairpin ornate and feminine, not something that belonged in an abandoned church. Samuel, she called, holding it up. Look at this. He took the hairpin, examining it closely. Silver, expensive. His expression hardened. And recent, no tarnish or dust. A woman was here, Clara said, stating the obvious, in an abandoned church with a freshly tuned piano. Not just any woman. Samuel pocketed the hairpin. This is high-quality something a seamstress from Blackwood's brothel wouldn't possess. His use of the euphemism was pointed. We need to find out more about the women connected to Blackwood and Howard. Clara nodded, following him out of the church. The bright morning seemed suddenly less welcoming, shadows lurking at the edges of her vision, where before there had been only light. Gerald Blackwood's general store dominated the north side of Willow Creek's main street, its freshly painted facade and large display windows a stark contrast to the faded buildings surrounding it. A bell jingled cheerfully as Clara and Samuel entered, announcing their presence to the empty store. Gerald emerged from the back room, his usual affable shopkeeper's smile freezing when he saw them. His right eye was swollen and discolored, a souvenir from his encounter with Samuel 2 nights before. Mrs. Winters, he said stiffly, ignoring Samuel completely. What can I help you with today? Clara handed him a short list. Just the essentials, Mr. Blackwood. Gerald took the list, his gaze finally shifting to Samuel. We don't serve his kind here. My kind? Samuel asked mildly, though Clara sensed the dangerous undercurrent in his voice. Troublemakers, Gerald clarified, his fingers tightening on Clara's list until the paper crumpled. Men who interfere in private business. Mr. Foster is my guest, Clara said firmly, and my employee. If you won't serve him, I'll take my business elsewhere. Gerald's face flushed with anger, but his merchant's instinct for profit apparently outweighed his desire for confrontation. Fine, but keep him under control. He turned to gather the items on Clara's list, muttering under his breath. While Gerald was occupied, Samuel wandered the store, ostensibly examining merchandise, but actually scanning for anything unusual. A hidden door, a suspicious ledger, any sign of the criminal activity he suspected occurred here. Looking for something specific, Gerald called sharply from behind the counter. Just browsing, Samuel replied, picking up a can of peaches and examining it with feigned interest. Gerald's eyes narrowed. Browsing usually leads to buying, Mr. Foster. Or are you just wasting my time? I'll take these, Samuel said, placing the peaches in a bag of kefir on the counter. He extracted a coin from his pocket, placing it deliberately beside the items. Gerald stared at the money as if it might bite him. After a moment's hesitation, he snatched it up and made change his movements brusque. Your supplies, Mrs. Winters, he said, pushing a small bundle across the counter toward Clara. That'll be $1.65. Clara counted out the money carefully. As she handed it over, Gerald leaned forward, his voice lowering. Our previous discussion isn't over, he said, eyes flicking toward Samuel and back. Your protection won't always be around. Is that a threat, Mr. Blackwood? Clara asked, her voice steady despite the chill that ran through her. A statement of fact. Gerald's smile didn't reach his eyes. End of the month, Mrs. Winters. One way or another, what's owed will be paid. Samuel stepped closer to Clara, his presence solid and reassuring at her side. We should go, he said quietly. We have other errands. Clara nodded, gathering her purchases. As they turned to leave, the store's bell jingled again, announcing another customer. Sheriff Sullivan entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. Mrs. Winters Foster. He acknowledged his gaze, taking in the tense tableau before him. Everything all right here? Just finishing our shopping, Sheriff, Clara replied, moving toward the door. Sullivan stepped aside to let them pass, but his hand shot out to grasp Samuel's arm as he followed. A word, Foster. Outside. Samuel nodded to Clara. I'll join you in a moment. Outside, Sullivan led Samuel a short distance from the store out of earshot of potential eavesdroppers. You're playing a dangerous game, he said without preamble. Not sure what you mean, Sheriff. Sullivan's weathered face creased with impatience. Don't insult my intelligence, Foster. I know exactly who and what you are. Samuel's expression remained neutral, though his body tensed imperceptibly. And what am I exactly? They called you the ghost at Antietam, Sullivan said, his voice lowered. Moved through Confederate lines like a spirit taking out sentries without a sound. 23 men by dawn. Never missed a shot, never left a trace. Samuel's jaw tightened. Few people knew that story and fewer still could connect it to him. That was a long time ago. Not long enough for men like us to forget, Sullivan countered. After the war, you disappeared. Rumors said you'd become a government man, a hunter. His gaze was steady, evaluating. Hunting, what I wonder. Like you said, Sheriff, that was a long time ago. Sullivan wasn't deterred. Then 3 years back, a judge in Carson's Valley turns up dead, shot through the heart at 300 yards. Professional job. No witnesses, no suspects. He leaned closer. Accept a description of a stranger passing through town. Tall man with a scar along his jaw. Good with a rifle. Samuel remained silent, neither confirming nor denying. That judge was protecting a trafficking ring, Sullivan continued, moving women to mining camps, press ganging drifters into labor. Ring a bell. Should it? Sullivan's patience visibly thinned. Cut the act, Foster. I know you're not here by coincidence. The question is, are you here officially or is this personal? Samuel considered his options. Sullivan clearly knew more than he'd initially assumed. The question was whether the sheriff was a potential ally or another obstacle. Both, he admitted finally. Marshal Collins sent me to investigate Gerald Blackwood and his associates, but I have my own reasons for pursuing men like him. Sullivan nodded slowly as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. Your sister, Sarah, wasn't it? Samuel's control slipped for a fraction of a second, genuine surprise flashing across his features before he regained his composure. You're well-informed, Sheriff. I make it my business to know who enters my town, Sullivan replied, especially men with your particular talents. A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the town going about its morning business. What do you want, Sullivan? Samuel asked finally. Same as you, I suspect. To see Gerald Blackwood and his associates answer for their crimes. Sullivan's expression hardened. 7 Union men have disappeared from this region in the past 18 months. One of them was my son. This revelation shifted Samuel's assessment of the situation entirely. Your son, Michael Sullivan, served with the 14th Brooklyn, same as me, came home with a wounded leg and troubled mind. Pain flashed in the sheriff's eyes. Last seen headed to Blackwood's lumber camp for work. Never returned. Samuel absorbed this information, pieces falling into place. That's why you haven't moved against Blackwood. You're hoping to find your son. I know my son is dead, Sullivan corrected harshly. What I want now is the men responsible. He straightened, adjusting his badge. So I'll ask again, Foster. Are you here to bring these men to justice or just to add more bodies to the count? Justice is the goal, Samuel replied carefully, but I won't hesitate to do what's necessary if lives are at stake. Sullivan studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. Fair enough, but remember this is my town. You work with me, not around me. Understood? Understood. Good. Sullivan replaced his hat. Now a piece of advice. Whatever's between you and Clara Winters, be careful. That woman's been through enough without adding your particular brand of trouble to her burden. Before Samuel could respond, Sullivan turned and limped back toward the store, leaving him to ponder the unexpected turn their conversation had taken. Across the street, Clara waited patiently, her packages clutched to her chest. The blue of her dress caught the morning light, making her appear younger, less careworn than the widow in black he'd first observed. When Samuel rejoined her, she didn't ask about his conversation with Sullivan, seeming to understand his need for privacy. Together, they continued their errands, moving through the small town with the careful awareness of 2 people who knew they were being watched. By the time they turned toward home, the sun had climbed high in the sky, casting short shadows on the dusty street. Neither noticed the stagecoach arriving at the far end of town, nor the slender woman who descended from it, her travel-worn appearance belying the sharp intelligence in her eyes as she surveyed her surroundings. The newcomer adjusted her hat, secured her carpet bag, and set off with purposeful strides toward the Rusty Nails Saloon, a woman with a mission of her own in the troubled town of Willow Creek. The woman from the stagecoach sat alone at a corner table in the Rusty Nail, nursing a glass of whiskey she had no intention of drinking. Her clothing was practical, men's trousers beneath a long coat, a hat pulled low over her features. Despite her best efforts to blend in, she attracted curious glances from the saloon's predominantly male clientele. When Samuel entered the establishment 2 hours later, her posture shifted subtly, a recognition so slight only the most observant would have noticed. Samuel paused in the doorway, scanning the room before his gaze settled on her. A flicker of surprise crossed his features, quickly masked. He made his way to her table, removing his hat as he sat opposite her. "You're early," he said quietly. "And you're compromised," she replied, her voice low and urgent. Words spreading, Samuel. People asking questions about a Pinkerton man hunting the Blackwoods. What people? Rebecca Foster, Samuel's younger sister, leaned forward, her gray eyes so similar to his own, intense with concern. "Marshal Collins received a telegram 3 days ago. Someone offering information about Judge Howard and the Blackwoods. Someone who knows about Carson's Valley." Samuel's expression remained neutral, but his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his hat brim. Could be a trap. Could be, or it could be someone with a legitimate grudge against them. Rebecca glanced around the saloon before continuing. "Collins wants you to proceed with caution. Gather evidence only. No direct confrontation until he arrives with federal warrants." Samuel nodded once, acknowledging the order without committing to it. "Any word on Nathaniel Blackwood's movements? Last seen in Denver 2 weeks ago. Word is he's headed this way." Rebecca's expression darkened. "Where there's merchandise to inspect." The euphemism for human trafficking hung between them, ugly in its clinical detachment. "I've confirmed the church as a holding location," Samuel said after a moment. "Found evidence of recent activity. And this." He extracted the silver hairpin from his pocket, sliding it across the table. Rebecca examined it carefully. "Expensive. Too fine for a local girl." "My thoughts exactly. Could belong to a victim being moved through." Rebecca pocketed the hairpin. "I'll check with our contacts in Denver, see if any wealthy women have gone missing recently." Samuel nodded, then changed the subject. "You're staying at the hotel?" "No, too visible. I've taken a room at the boarding house on the edge of town, Mrs. Patterson's place." Rebecca studied her brother's face. "And you, where are you staying?" Samuel hesitated, knowing his sister wouldn't approve. "With a widow outside town. Clara Winters. Her husband died 2 years ago, leaving debts to Gerald Blackwood." Rebecca's eyebrows rose. "You're staying with a potential victim. That's unlike you, Samuel. Usually you maintain your distance." "It's a strategic position," he replied, not quite meeting her gaze. "Gives me a reason to be near Blackwood's operations while providing her some protection." "Protection," Rebecca repeated skeptically. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Samuel's expression hardened. "It's not like that." "It never is until it is." Rebecca sighed, a sound of exasperation tinged with genuine concern. "Every time you try to save someone, you end up in more trouble than they were in to begin with. Remember St. Louis or Carson's Valley? This is different. That's what you said the last 2 times. Rebecca leaned forward, lowering her voice further. "Samuel, you can't save everyone, and you certainly can't bring Sarah back by saving every woman in danger who crosses your path." The mention of their sister sent a visible shock through Samuel's normally composed demeanor. "This isn't about Sarah, isn't it?" Rebecca's gaze was piercing, seeing through the defenses her brother had carefully constructed. 8 years, Samuel. 8 years you've been hunting these men. At what point does justice become obsession? Samuel didn't answer, his jaw tight with suppressed emotion. Rebecca softened slightly, reaching across the table to touch his hand briefly. "I'm not saying stop. I'm saying be careful, especially with this widow. The last thing either of you needs is more loss." Samuel nodded once, acknowledging her concern without accepting its premise. "What's your next move?" Recognizing the deflection but choosing not to press further, Rebecca outlined her plan. I'll work the edges. Talk to the seamstresses at Blackwood's brothel, see what they know about missing girls. Check stagecoach records for patterns. The usual. Be careful, Samuel cautioned. Gerald Blackwood knows this town inside out. Eyes everywhere. I'm always careful, Rebecca replied with a hint of a smile. Unlike some people I could name. Their conversation concluded with arrangements to meet again in 2 days. As Samuel rose to leave, Rebecca caught his sleeve. One more thing, she said, her expression serious once more. This widow Clara, how much have you told her? Enough for her to understand the danger. Not enough to compromise the investigation. Rebecca nodded, though she didn't look entirely convinced. Keep it that way. The fewer people who know the full extent of what we're doing, the safer everyone will be. Samuel left the saloon, stepping into the late afternoon sunlight with a troubled mind. Rebecca's warnings about becoming too involved with Clara had struck closer to home than he cared to admit. There was something about the widow that had gotten under his skin, her quiet strength, her perceptiveness, the way she carried her grief like armor rather than a burden. It was dangerous, this growing connection. Dangerous for the investigation, dangerous for Clara, and dangerous for the carefully maintained distance Samuel had cultivated since Sarah's death, since Carson's Valley. Yet as he made his way back to Clara's cabin, he couldn't bring himself to regret the decision to stay with her. Protection was a convenient explanation, but not the whole truth. The whole truth was more complicated, more human than Samuel wanted to acknowledge. Clara was not at the cabin when Samuel returned. A note on the table informed him she had gone to visit the boarding house at the edge of town, her euphemism for Blackwood's brothel. Gone to check on Ruby's condition. Back before dark. Concern flared in Samuel's voice. The brothel was firmly in Blackwood's territory, and after their confrontation that morning, Gerald would be looking for ways to strike back. Clara's medical skills gave her a plausible reason to be there, but it was still a risk. Samuel debated following her immediately, then reconsidered. Clara was capable and intelligent. Rushing after her would suggest he didn't trust her judgment. Instead, he used the opportunity to conduct a more thorough examination of the cabin and its surroundings, looking for anything that might connect to his investigation. In the small shed behind the cabin, he found a locked chest pushed against the back wall. The lock was simple, yielding easily to his picking tools. Inside lay James Winter's personal effects uniforms, both Confederate gray and Union blue. Interesting letters, a journal, and photographs. Samuel hesitated, aware he was violating Clara's privacy, but the investigation took precedence over personal considerations. He examined the journal, first flipping through pages of entries that documented James Winter's journey from Confederate soldier to Union supporter, his meeting with the Clara in a field hospital, their marriage, and their move to Willow Creek. The final entries, dated just before James's death, caught Samuel's attention. April 12, 1870. Something isn't right with Blackwood's accounts. Discrepancies in the ledger I cannot reconcile. Where is this money coming from? And these shipments marked only as merchandise. No details, no origins, no destinations. When I asked G about them, he became defensive, then offered to reduce my debt if I would forget what I saw. I declined. April 15, 1870. Meeting J. Tonight by the creek. He claims to have information about G's operation. Says it goes beyond mere smuggling. I must know the truth, though, Clara worries. The creek is high with spring rains. She fears a flood, but this cannot wait. The journal ended there. According to town records and Clara's account, James Winters had drowned that night when the creek flooded its banks. His body had been found 2 miles downstream the following morning. Samuel carefully replaced the journal and continued his search. At the bottom of the chest beneath a folded uniform, he found a sealed envelope addressed to Clara in James's handwriting. The seal was unbroken. She had never seen it. Moral qualms battled with investigative necessity. After a moment's hesitation, Samuel carefully opened the envelope, extracting a single sheet of paper. My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, something has happened to me. I pray it has not, that I will return tonight and destroy this letter, but I must take precautions. What I have discovered about Gerald Blackwood goes beyond mere financial impropriety. He is involved in something truly evil, the trafficking of human beings. Former soldiers, vulnerable women, even children. all moved through Willow Creek to mining camps and worse places further west. I have evidence a ledger containing names, dates, payments. Tonight I meet with Jenkins, who claims to have more information about the operation. If all goes well, we will take this to the federal authorities. If I do not return, go to Sheriff Sullivan. He knows more than he admits, and despite our differences, I believe he is a good man at heart. Show him this letter. Tell him where to find the ledger hidden in the loose floorboard beneath our bed. Most importantly, my love, get away from Willow Creek. Gerald Blackwood is dangerous, and he has powerful friends, including Judge Howard. If something happens to me, you will not be safe here. I love you more than life itself. Forgive me for keeping these matters from you. I only wanted to protect you from this darkness. Always yours. James. Samuel read the letter twice, his mind racing. If James Winters had indeed discovered evidence of Blackwood's operation 2 years ago, why hadn't Clara acted on it? The obvious answer was that she had never received it. The letter had remained sealed in the chest. But that raised another question. Why had James hidden it in a place she might not look, rather than somewhere obvious? And what had happened to the ledger he mentioned? Samuel carefully resealed the letter using steam from the kettle to soften the adhesive, then returned everything to the chest exactly as he'd found it. This discovery changed things. James Winters hadn't simply drowned in a flood. He had been investigating the very same criminal enterprise Samuel was pursuing. The coincidence was too great. Had Gerald Blackwood murdered James Winters to protect his operation? And if so, was Clara truly ignorant of her husband's activities? Or was there more to her story than she had shared? Samuel was still pondering these questions when Clara returned just before sunset. She looked tired but oddly energized, her face flushed with purpose in a way he hadn't seen before. Ruby's consumption is advancing, she said without preamble, hanging her shawl by the door. I've done what I can to ease her breathing, but without proper treatment. She trailed off the prognosis obvious to both of them. Tuberculosis was a death sentence for most, especially in conditions like a frontier brothel. You took a risk going there, Samuel observed, setting water to boil for tea. Clara's chin lifted slightly in defiance. Those women need medical attention. No one else in town will help them. Gerald Blackwood won't appreciate your interference. I don't care what Gerald Blackwood appreciates. Clara began unpacking her medical bag, setting instruments aside for cleaning. Besides, I learned something valuable. One of the girls Emma told me about special visitors who come to select women for private establishments further west. Samuel's interest sharpened. Did she mention names? No names, but she described one man as tall, fair-haired, with a beard trimmed like an Englishman. Said he works with Gerald, but is more refined. Clara looked up from her task. Could be Nathaniel Blackwood. Matches his description, Samuel confirmed, impressed with her initiative. Did Emma say when he's expected next? Soon, within the week, according to what she overheard. Samuel nodded, filing this information away. Nathaniel Blackwood's arrival would likely accelerate their timetable. If the pattern held true, he would select merchandise for transport soon after, which meant Samuel and Rebecca needed to gather their evidence quickly. There's something else, Clara said, her voice dropping lower. Emma mentioned a woman who stays at Judge Howard's home when she visits. Described her as beautiful but cold as ice. Said the judge treats her like royalty, but she's clearly afraid of him. A prisoner disguised as a guest, Samuel mused. Did Emma know her name? Clara shook her head. Only that she wears fine clothes and jewelry, silver hairpins with pearl accents. Samuel's gaze shot to Clara as a silent communication passing between them. The hairpin from the church. We need to find out who she is, Clara said, already moving toward the door. I should go back, ask more questions. No, Samuel interrupted, catching her arm gently. You've done enough for today. Gerald will be suspicious if you return so soon. Clara hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. You're right, but we can't just wait. If this woman is being held against her will, we'll help her, Samuel assured her. But rushing in without information could endanger her further. He released Clara's arm, aware he had held it longer than necessary. My sister arrived in town today. She'll help us investigate. Your sister? Clara's surprise was evident. You never mentioned a sister. Rebecca. She works with me sometimes. Samuel avoided elaborating on the extent of their partnership. She's good at extracting information without raising suspicions. Clara studied him with that penetrating gaze that always made Samuel feel exposed. There's a lot you haven't told me, isn't there? Yes, he admitted. Some of it for your protection. Some because he trailed off, unable to articulate the complex reasons for his reticence. Because trust doesn't come easily to you, Clara finished for him. I understand that better than most. The kettle whistled, breaking the moment of unexpected intimacy. As Samuel prepared tea, Clara continued cleaning her instruments, each falling into the comfortable rhythm they had established over the past days. I found something while you were gone, Samuel said, finally deciding that partial honesty was necessary. In the shed, a chest with your husband's belongings. Clara's hands stilled. You went through James's things. I did, Samuel acknowledged, not attempting to justify it. I found his journal. The last entries mentioned Gerald Blackwood's suspicious accounts. He was investigating Gerald before he died. Clara's face paled. That's impossible. James was a merchant, not... She trailed off, processing this revelation. He never said anything about investigating Gerald. He was protecting you, Samuel said gently. The last entry mentioned meeting someone by the creek the night he died. Someone with information about Blackwood's operation. Clara sank into a chair, her composure finally cracking. Are you saying James didn't simply drown, that Gerald Blackwood killed him? I'm saying it's a possibility we need to consider. Tears filled Clara's eyes, the first Samuel had seen from her. 2 years, she whispered. For 2 years I believed it was an accident, that the flood took him. That's what Sullivan told me when they found his body. Samuel hesitated, then made a decision. There's more. I found a letter James wrote to you the day he died. It was hidden in the chest, sealed. He extracted the envelope from his pocket. You should read it. Clara took the letter with trembling hands, breaking the seal Samuel had carefully reconstructed. As she read, emotions chased across her face, disbelief, horror, grief, and finally a cold, hard anger. Gerald Blackwood, she said when she finished, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. All this time, he looked me in the eye. They extended my husband's debts, threatened me. Her fingers tightened on the paper until it crumpled. And Judge Howard, both of them involved. The letter mentions a ledger, Samuel prompted gently, hidden beneath your bed. Clara rose immediately, crossing to the bed in the corner. She knelt and pried up a floorboard Samuel had missed in his earlier search. The space beneath was empty. It's gone, she said, her voice hollow. James said it contained evidence, names, dates, payments. Everything needed to bring down Blackwood's operation. Gerald must have found it after James died, Samuel reasoned, or perhaps this Jenkins took it. No one named Jenkins lived in Willow Creek 2 years ago, Clara said, replacing the floorboard. At least no one I knew of. Samuel filed this information away for further investigation. The letter mentions Sullivan knowing more than he admits. Do you think he could be involved? Clara considered this, wiping away her tears with a determined gesture. No. James trusted him despite their differences, and Sullivan has always been protective of me in his way. She looked up at Samuel, new resolve hardening her features. I need to speak with him. He needs to know what really happened to James. It's too late tonight, Samuel cautioned, and we need to be careful. If Gerald Blackwood murdered your husband and has been covering it up for 2 years, he won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens to expose him. Clara nodded, though the determined set of her jaw suggested she had no intention of remaining silent for long. Tomorrow, then, we'll go to Sullivan first thing in the morning. Samuel agreed, relieved she wasn't insisting on immediate action. As they finished their tea and prepared for the night, he observed the subtle changes in Clara's demeanor, the straightening of her spine, the purposeful movements, the occasional flash of anger in her eyes. Grief was transforming into something harder, more dangerous. He recognized the transformation because he had experienced it himself after Sarah's death. The moment when sorrow crystallized into purpose, when the need for justice overcame the paralysis of loss. Clara Winters was no longer simply a widow in need of protection. She was becoming an ally in his mission, and potentially a formidable one. As Samuel settled onto his makeshift bed by the hearth, he updated his mental assessment of the situation. With Clara now fully aware of Blackwood's crimes and personally invested in bringing him to justice, the investigation had both gained a valuable asset and become considerably more complicated. Rebecca's warning echoed in his mind. Every time you try to save someone, you end up in more trouble than they were in to begin with. Looking at Clara's determined face as she extinguished the lamp, Samuel couldn't help but wonder if this time it might be the other way around. Dawn had barely broken when pounding on the cabin door jolted Samuel and Clara from sleep. Samuel was on his feet instantly, revolver in hand, while Clara hurriedly donned a robe over her nightgown. "Mrs. Winters," a young voice called urgently. "Mrs. Winters, please." Clara opened the door to find a girl of about 16 standing on the porch, her face tear-streaked and frightened. Samuel recognized her as one of the younger seamstresses from Blackwood's brothel. "Emma," Clara pulled the girl inside, checking behind her for pursuers. "What's happened?" "It's Ruby," Emma sobbed, collapsing into a chair. "She's worse, coughing blood all night. Duchess says she won't last the day without help." Clara was already moving, pulling her medical bag from the shelf. "I'll come right away." "Wait," Samuel cautioned, laying a hand on her arm. "This could be a trap. Gerald knows you interfered yesterday." Emma shook her head vehemently. "No trap. Duchess sent me secret-like. Said not to tell Mr. Blackwood, or he'd be angry about fetching a proper doctor." She looked pleadingly at Clara. "Ruby's my friend. Please." Clara's expression softened. "Of course I'll come." She turned to Samuel. "This can't wait. Ruby needs immediate attention." Samuel recognized the determination in her voice, the same tone she'd used when speaking of her husband's letter the night before. There would be no dissuading her. "I'm coming with you," he said, reaching for his coat and hat. "No," Clara countered firmly. "If Gerald is at the brothel seeing us together, we'll only escalate the situation." She touched his arm briefly. "Go to Sheriff Sullivan as we planned. Show him James's letter. I'll be fine with Emma." Samuel wanted to argue, but logic supported her position. Dividing their efforts would accomplish more, and Sullivan needed to be brought into their confidence if they hoped to move against Blackwood and Howard. "Be careful," he said finally. "At the first sign of the trouble, I'll leave immediately." Clara promised, though they both knew she wouldn't abandon a patient in need. After they departed, Samuel gathered his weapons and the letter setting out for the sheriff's office. The town was quiet in the early morning. Most businesses not yet open, though smoke rose from a few chimneys as Willow Creek began to stir. Sullivan's office was dark when Samuel arrived, the door locked. He tried the jail around back and found it similarly secured. The sheriff was not at his post, unusual for a man known for his dedication to duty. Samuel debated his next move. He could wait for Sullivan to appear, but instinct told him something wasn't right. If the sheriff had been called away on urgent business, Samuel needed to know what and why. He made his way to the Rusty Nail, finding it open despite the early hour. The bartender, Tom, was wiping down tables, preparing for the day's business. "Morning," Samuel greeted him. "Looking for Sheriff Sullivan." "Seen him." Tom glanced up, recognition dawning. "Foster right." He continued his work, apparently unconcerned. "Sheriff rode out last night. Some trouble at the lumber camp north of town." "What kind of trouble?" Tom shrugged. "Didn't say. Got a message and left in a hurry. Mentioned he might be gone a couple days." This was concerning. The lumber camp was Gerald Blackwood's operation, the same one where Sullivan's son had last been seen before disappearing. The timing seemed suspiciously convenient, removing the sheriff from town just as Samuel and Clara were preparing to confront him with evidence of Blackwood's crime. "Any other law in town while he's gone?" Samuel asked casually. "Just Deputy Wilson, but he's visiting family in Taylor's Ridge." Tom looked up, a knowing glint in his eye. "Town's wide open, so to speak. Why planning some trouble, Foster?" "Just the opposite," Samuel replied mildly. "Thanks for the information." As he left the saloon, Samuel's mind raced. With Sullivan gone and his deputy absent, Willow Creek had no official law presence. If Gerald Blackwood had engineered this situation, it suggested he was preparing for something significant, possibly connected to his brother Nathaniel's imminent arrival. Samuel needed to find Rebecca to warn her of this development and reassess their strategy. And he needed to check on Clara at the brothel, Sullivan's absence, making her position there even more precarious. First, however, he needed to confirm Sullivan's departure wasn't voluntary. The sheriff's home, a small cabin on the outskirts of town opposite from Clara's, might hold clues to his sudden departure. The cabin was locked, but Samuel made quick work of the simple mechanism. Inside, he found evidence of a hasty departure, a half-eaten meal on the table, a coat tossed over a chair, rather than hung properly, a drawer left partially open. Sullivan was meticulous by nature. This disarray suggested urgency, possibly duress. On the floor near the door, barely visible in the dim light, Samuel spotted a small object. He knelt to examine it, a brass button from a vest engraved with an ornate B. Blackwood. This confirmed his suspicions. Sullivan hadn't left willingly. He had been lured or forced away from town, likely to prevent him from interfering with whatever Gerald Blackwood had planned. Samuel pocketed the button and continued his search, looking for anything that might indicate where Sullivan had gone or what message had drawn him away. In the bedroom, he found a telegram crumpled beside the bed. Information about Michael's stop. Come alone to North Camp. Stop midnight. Urgent. Stop. The message was unsigned. To anyone else, it might have appeared legitimate, a lead about Sullivan's missing son that required immediate, discreet follow-up. But to Samuel, with his knowledge of Gerald's operation, it screamed trap. The North Lumber Camp was remote, a good 3 hours' ride from town. If Sullivan had left at midnight, as the telegram suggested, he would have arrived around 3 in the morning, tired, possibly desperate for news of his son, and vulnerable to ambush. Samuel checked his pocket watch. Nearly 7 now. If Sullivan was in trouble, every hour increased the danger. But rushing blindly into a potential trap would help no one. He needed more information, and he needed to ensure Clara's safety before pursuing the sheriff. As he exited Sullivan's cabin, Samuel spotted a familiar figure hurrying down the street toward him. Rebecca, her face taut with urgency. "Samuel," she called softly as she approached. "We have a problem." "Several from the look of things," he replied, ushering her away from potential observers. "Sullivan's gone lured to Blackwood's lumber camp last night with a false lead about his son." Rebecca nodded grimly. "That's not all. Nathaniel Blackwood arrived on the midnight stage. I saw him at the hotel earlier." Samuel's concern deepened. "He's early. The information we had suggested he wouldn't arrive until next week." "Plans changed, apparently." Rebecca glanced around before continuing. "There's more. Judge Howard is holding court today, a special session. Word is they're going to try someone for theft from the general store. Someone who confessed overnight." "Who?" "A drifter named Jenkins, picked up yesterday evening." Samuel froze. Jenkins, the name from James Winter's letter, the informant he was meeting the night he died. Jenkins is alive. Rebecca's eyebrows rose at his reaction. "You know him?" Samuel quickly explained about James's letter and the missing ledger. If this is the same Jenkins, he might have crucial information about Blackwood's operation from 2 years ago. Or he might be a convenient scapegoat, Rebecca countered. Someone with no connections who can be eliminated legally through the court system. Either way, we need to speak with him before the trial. Samuel's mind worked rapidly, calculating possibilities. When is court in session? 10 this morning. Town hall. That gave them 3 hours. "Where's Clara now?" Samuel asked, shifting gears. "At the brothel, treating a sick girl." "Why by Gerald engineered Sullivan's absence. With Nathaniel in town and Judge Howard holding a special court session, something significant is happening today." Samuel's expression hardened. "Clara could be in danger, especially if Gerald connects her to James's investigation." Rebecca caught his arm as he turned to leave. "Samuel, wait. We need a plan. Charging into Blackwood's brothel will only escalate the situation." She was right, of course. Samuel forced himself to think strategically rather than reactively. "We need to divide our efforts. You try to get access to Jenkins before the trial. I'll check on Clara and then reconnoiter Blackwood's store. With Gerald distracted by his brother's arrival, I might be able to access his office and find the evidence we need." Rebecca nodded, accepting the division of labor. "And Sullivan? If we don't hear from him by noon, I'll ride to the lumber camp." Samuel checked his weapons with practiced efficiency. "Be careful, Rebecca. With Sullivan gone, there's no law in Willow Creek to stop Blackwood if he decides we're a threat." "I'm always careful," she reminded him with a grim smile. "It's you I worry about." They parted ways, Rebecca heading toward the jail, where Jenkins would be held. Samuel making his way to the blue-painted building at the edge of town that housed Gerald Blackwood's seamstresses. The brothel was quiet when Samuel arrived, and its windows still shuttered against the morning light. He approached cautiously, aware that his presence here would be immediately suspicious. Instead of using the front entrance, he circled to the back, finding a service door that led to the kitchen. The cook, an older woman with arms strong from years of kneading dough, looked up in surprise as he entered. "This ain't the public entrance, mister," she said, brandishing a rolling pin defensively. Samuel held up his hands in a non-threatening gesture. I'm looking for Mrs. Winters. The nurse, I was told she's treating Ruby. The cook's expression softened slightly at the mention of the sick girl. Upstairs end of the hall, but Duchess won't like a man up there this early paying customer or not. I'm not a customer, Samuel clarified. I'm a friend of Mrs. Winters. It's important I speak with her. Something in his tone must have conveyed the urgency because the cook nodded toward a back staircase. That way, quieter than the main stairs, but be quick about it. Samuel thanked her and ascended the stairs silently, years of practice, allowing him to avoid the creaking boards that might announce his presence. The upstairs hallway was dimly lit, doors closed on either side, the private rooms where Blackwood's seamstresses plied their trade. At the end of the hall, one door stood partially open. Samuel approached cautiously, peering inside to find Clara bent over a bed where a painfully thin young woman lay, her breathing labored and rattling. Clara was bathing the girl's forehead with a damp cloth, speaking soft words of encouragement that didn't quite mask the gravity of the situation. Samuel knocked gently on the doorframe. Clara looked up, surprise and then relief crossing her features. Samuel, she said quietly, rising from her chair beside the bed. What are you doing here? We need to talk, he replied, gesturing for her to join him in the hallway. It's urgent. Clara glanced back at her patient, clearly reluctant to leave. Ruby's condition is critical. I can't abandon her now. Sullivan's gone, Samuel said bluntly. Lured away last night. Nathaniel Blackwood arrived on the midnight stage and Judge Howard is holding a special court session this morning to try a man named Jenkins. Clara's face paled at the name. Jenkins, the man James was meeting the night he died. Possibly, we need to find out. Samuel glanced at Ruby, genuine sympathy in his expression. I understand your commitment to your patient, but there are larger forces at work. With Sullivan gone, there's no one to maintain order if Gerald decides to move against us. Clara hesitated, torn between her duty as a healer and the growing danger around them. I can't just leave her to die, Samuel. I'm not asking you to, he assured her, but we need a plan. How long can you stabilize her for? Clara considered the question professionally. I've given her laudanum for the pain and positioned her to help drain the fluid from her lungs. With proper care, she might last another day or two, but she didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew Ruby's prognosis was grim. Is there someone who can sit with her by being comfortable while you step away briefly? Emma, Clara decided. She's devoted to Ruby. She'll follow my instructions precisely. Good. Have Emma stay with Ruby. Tell the others you're going for more medicine or supplies, whatever seems most plausible. Meet me behind the general store in 30 minutes. Samuel touched her arm briefly. We'll come back for Ruby once we've addressed the immediate threat. Clara nodded, her expression resolute despite the worry in her eyes. 30 minutes. Samuel slipped away as silently as he had arrived, leaving Clara to make arrangements for Ruby's care. Outside, he circled the building, finding a vantage point that gave him a clear view of both the brothel and the general store across town. Through his field glass, he observed unusual activity at the store. Gerald Blackwood stood on the porch in animated conversation with a taller, slimmer man, whose fair hair and neatly trimmed beard matched the description of Nathaniel Blackwood. Beside them, Judge Howard's imposing figure completed the triumvirate, his black coat and silver-handled walking stick, marking him as a man of authority. The three men eventually moved inside, closing the door behind them. Samuel lowered his glass, a grim satisfaction settling over him. All three targets in one location, a rare opportunity, but also a sign that whatever they were planning was significant enough to warrant a face-to-face meeting. He needed to get closer to overhear their conversation if possible. But first he had to ensure Clara made it safely away from the brothel. Samuel was about to change position when movement near the stagecoach stop caught his eye. A man had just descended from a newly arrived coach, a man whose familiar profile sent a jolt of shock through Samuel's system. Average height, lean build, light brown hair, cut short in a military style, a distinctive limp favoring the right leg. It couldn't be. And yet, through his field glass, Samuel studied the newcomer's face as he turned to survey the town. Despite 2 years of presumed death, the features were unmistakable, matching precisely the photographs Samuel had seen in Clara's cabin. James Winters was alive, and he was walking purposefully toward the sheriff's office, a man with a mission returning to a town that had long since buried him. For a moment, Samuel couldn't move, paralyzed by the implications of what he was witnessing. James Winters. Clara's husband, supposedly drowned 2 years ago, was alive and walking the streets of Willow Creek as if returning from a mere journey rather than the grave. Samuel's mind raced through possibilities. Had James faked his death to escape Gerald Blackwood? If so, why abandon Clara to Gerald's predations for 2 years? Or had he been forcibly kept away, perhaps, as leverage against Clara? And most pressingly, how would Clara react to this resurrection? Forcing himself to focus on immediate concerns, Samuel changed position, keeping James in sight while remaining hidden. James moved with purpose toward the sheriff's office, checked the locked door, then turned toward the general store where Gerald Nathaniel and Judge Howard were meeting. James hesitated at the store's entrance, his hand moving briefly to something concealed beneath his coat, a weapon Samuel surmised. After a moment's deliberation, James continued past the store and headed toward the Rusty Nail Saloon instead. Samuel debated following him, but remembered his arrangement to meet Clara. Her safety took precedence over pursuing James, especially since she was unaware of her husband's unexpected return. Moving swiftly through back alleys, Samuel positioned himself behind the general store, his mind still grappling with this new development. James Winter's return complicated an already dangerous situation. The man clearly had unfinished business with Gerald Blackwood, business that could interfere with their investigation or potentially endanger Clara. Clara arrived precisely on schedule, slipping quietly around the corner of the building. She had exchanged her nursing apron for a shawl, her medical bag clutched in one hand. "Emma is watching Ruby," she reported, her voice low. "I told Duchess I needed supplies from my cabin. We have perhaps an hour before my absence becomes suspicious." Samuel nodded, struggling to find the right words to convey what he had just witnessed. Before he could speak, Clara noticed his expression. "What is it?" she asked, instantly alert. "Has something happened?" Samuel took a breath. "Clara, there's no easy way to tell you this. Your husband is alive." Clara's face drained of color. "What?" "James Winters arrived on the morning stage. I saw him walking toward the sheriff's office, then the saloon." Samuel gently grasped her arm, steadying her as she swayed slightly. "I'm certain it was him. He matches the photographs in your cabin exactly." "That's impossible," Clara whispered, her voice hollow with shock. "They found his body. Sullivan identified him. I buried him." "Apparently someone else was buried in his place," Samuel replied grimly. "James Winters is very much alive, and he's here in Willow Creek right now." Clara's mind visibly raced, connecting pieces of a puzzle suddenly reshaped by this revelation. "The letter," she said finally. "James was investigating Gerald Blackwood. If Gerald discovered this, he might have attempted to kill James," Samuel finished, "but failed. The body found was likely Jenkins, the informant James was meeting that night. But why wouldn't James come back to me?" Clara's voice broke slightly, hurt and confusion warring in her expression. "Why let me believe he was dead for 2 years?" "I don't know," Samuel admitted, "but we need to find out. If James has evidence against Blackwood from 2 years ago combined with what we've gathered—" Clara straightened, shock giving way to determination. "Where did you see him last?" "Heading into the Rusty Nail." Samuel hesitated, concern evident. "Clara, we should approach this carefully. After 2 years, we don't know what circumstances brought James back now or where his loyalties lie." Clara's eyes flashed. "He's my husband, Samuel." "A husband who lets you believe he was dead," Samuel reminded her gently, "who left you to Gerald Blackwood's mercies for 2 years. Pain crossed Clara's features, but she squared her shoulders. "I need to see him, to hear his explanation." She looked up at Samuel, her expression softening slightly. "But I won't go alone. Will you come with me?" Samuel nodded, relieved she wasn't rushing headlong into a potentially dangerous reunion. "We'll approach cautiously, observe before engaging." Together they made their way toward the Rusty Nail, using back streets to avoid being seen. The saloon was relatively quiet at this early hour, only a few patrons nursing morning drinks or picking at simple breakfasts. James Winters sat alone at a corner table, a cup of coffee before him, his back to the wall, a soldier's habit of never exposing himself to attack from behind. His appearance had changed somewhat from his photographs. His face was leaner, more weathered, with new lines around his eyes and mouth. But the essential features remained the same: the straight nose, the firm jaw, the thoughtful set of his brow. Clara's step faltered at the sight of him. Samuel felt her tremble beneath his steadying hand. "He's real," she whispered, as if still unable to fully believe. He's actually alive. Before Samuel could suggest a strategy for approach, James looked up, his gaze sweeping the room. Another soldier's habit, and locked on Clara. For a moment, time seemed suspended as husband and wife stared at each other across the width of the saloon, 2 years of separation and presumed death hanging between them. James rose slowly, his cup forgotten. "Clara," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite its softness. Clara moved forward as if drawn by an invisible force, Samuel following closely, alert for any sign of threat. As they reached James's table, he extended a hand toward Clara, not quite touching her, as if uncertain of his welcome. "You're alive," Clara said, her voice a mixture of wonder, relief, and accusation. "I am," James confirmed, his gaze moving briefly to Samuel, noting his protective proximity to Clara. Though it was a near thing. "2 years," Clara said, her voice strengthening. "2 years I believed you dead. I buried you. I mourned you." James's expression tightened with regret. "I know, and I can't begin to apologize adequately." He gestured to the empty chairs at his table. "Please sit. I'll explain everything." Clara hesitated, then sat, Samuel taking the chair beside her, positioned to intervene if necessary. James's gaze lingered on Samuel, assessing. "And you are," he asked finally. "Samuel Foster." Samuel replied, offering no further explanation. James nodded, seemingly accepting this minimal introduction. "You've been protecting my wife in my absence, I gather." "Someone needed to," Clara interjected, a hint of bitterness in her tone. "Gerald Blackwood has been pressuring me about your debts for 2 years. Pain flashed across James's features. "I'm sorry, Clara. More than I can say." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "But I had no choice. Gerald Blackwood tried to kill me that night. If he knew I survived, you would have been in danger." Samuel finished, understanding the logic, if not entirely accepting it. As would Clara. James nodded. "Exactly. I couldn't return until I had enough evidence to bring down Blackwood and his associates completely. Evidence that would ensure Clara's safety." "And do you—" Clara asked, her gaze steady despite the emotions Samuel could sense roiling beneath her composed exterior. "Have evidence, I mean." "Yes." James glanced around the saloon before continuing in an even lower voice. "Names, dates, financial records. Everything needed to prosecute Gerald Nathaniel and Judge Howard for trafficking, extortion, even murder." "The ledger mentioned in your letter," Clara said. "You took it with you that night." James looked surprised. "You found my letter. It was hidden." "In your chest in the shed," Clara confirmed. "Samuel found it yesterday." James's gaze shifted to Samuel, reassessing him with new interest. "You've been investigating Blackwood as well." Samuel nodded. "For Pinkerton, following a trail of missing Union veterans across 3 territories. Understanding dawned in James's eyes. "The missing soldiers. I've tracked 8 over the past 2 years. Forced labor in mining camps mostly." "7 in my records," Samuel corrected, though Sheriff Sullivan believes his son Michael may be among them. 8, James insisted grimly. "The latest disappeared just 3 weeks ago from Taylor's Ridge. Jenkins helped me document the pattern." "Jenkins?" Clara repeated. "The man you were meeting the night you disappeared. The man bore out as having tried today." James's expression sharpened. "Jenkins is here in Willow Creek. Being held for trial this morning," Samuel confirmed. "Special session, Judge Howard presiding." "We need to stop it," James said urgently. "Jenkins is my key witness. He worked for Nathaniel Blackwood in Denver before growing a conscience. He has first-hand knowledge of their entire operation." "That explains the rush to try him," Samuel reasoned. "With Sullivan conveniently absent, they can eliminate Jenkins legally through the court system." Clara's mind moved quickly to practical concerns. "The trial is set for 10 o'clock. That gives us less than an hour." She turned to James, her expression both vulnerable and determined. "I have questions, so many questions about these past 2 years. But they'll have to wait. First, we need to save Jenkins and expose the Blackwoods." James nodded, accepting her prioritization. "I've been working with federal marshals. Marshal Collins is on his way with warrants, but he won't arrive until tomorrow at the earliest." "Collins," Samuel repeated, exchanging a glance with Clara. "He's my contact as well." James smiled grimly. "It seems we've been working the same case from different angles, Mr. Foster." "So it would appear," Samuel agreed, though he remained cautious. Something about this situation still felt wrong, pieces that didn't quite fit. Why would James return now, just as they were closing in on the Blackwoods? And how had he survived that night 2 years ago, when a body, presumably Jenkins's, had been found and identified as his? "We need a plan," Clara said, cutting through Samuel's thoughts. "Jenkins is likely being held at the jail. Without Sullivan, who has the keys, Deputy Wilson would be next in line," James replied. "But Wilson's family is in Taylor's Ridge. He visits them every other weekend." "Convenient," Samuel noted. "So who's watching Jenkins?" "One of Gerald's men, most likely," James said. "He controls most aspects of town governance through debt and intimidation." Samuel made a decision. "I'll check the jail, see who's guarding Jenkins, and whether we can get access to him before the trial." "I'll go with you," James offered, rising from his chair. "No," Samuel countered firmly. "You're supposed to be dead. If Gerald or his men spot you before we're ready, we lose our advantage of surprise." James looked as if he might argue, but Clara laid a hand on his arm, the first time she had touched him since his return. "Samuel's right. Your appearance at the trial will have maximum impact. Until then, you should remain out of sight." The contact seemed to affect James deeply. He covered Clara's hand with his own. "All right, I'll wait here until closer to the trial time." Samuel noted the exchange with a complex mixture of emotions he chose not to examine too closely. "Clara, you should return to the brothel. Ruby needs your care, and your continued presence there won't raise suspicions." Clara nodded, though reluctance was evident in her expression. "What about Rebecca? Can she help with Jenkins?" "She's already attempting to access him," Samuel replied. "I'll find her, coordinate our efforts." As they finalized their plan, Samuel found himself watching the interaction between Clara and James with unwilling fascination. There was distance between them, the inevitable result of 2 years separation and presumed death, but also an undeniable connection that had survived despite everything. Something twisted in Samuel's chest, sharp and unexpected. He pushed the feeling aside, focusing instead on the tactical challenges ahead. Jenkins' testimony could be crucial to building a case against the Blackwoods, especially if James's evidence proved insufficient on its own. They parted ways outside the saloon, Clara returning reluctantly to the brothel, James remaining inside to avoid being seen, and Samuel heading toward the jail to find Rebecca and assess the situation with Jenkins. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows as Willow Creek fully awakened to what promised to be a day of reckoning one way or another. The jail stood silent in the morning light, its windows dark, the door firmly locked. No smoke rose from the chimney, despite the cool morning air, a sign the building was likely unoccupied. Samuel circled the structure, cautiously checking each window for signs of movement within. Finding none, he moved to the back door, which yielded easily to his lockpicks. Inside, the cells stood empty, no sign of Jenkins or any other prisoner. Something was wrong. A prisoner awaiting trial should have been secured here, especially one as potentially valuable as Jenkins. Samuel searched the sheriff's desk, finding nothing unusual except the day's mail unopened in Sullivan's absence. As he turned to leave, the front door opened. Samuel drew his revolver instinctively, then relaxed slightly as Rebecca entered, her expression shifting from surprise to relief at the sight of him. "Samuel," she said, closing the door behind her, "I've been looking for you." "Jenkins is gone," Samuel replied without preamble. "Not in his cell, no sign of a guard either." Rebecca nodded grimly. "I know. He's been moved to the town hall basement. Gerald's men are guarding him there until the trial." She hesitated, then added, "There's more. James Winters is alive." "I know," Samuel confirmed. "I saw him arrive on the morning stage. He's at the Rusty Nail now, keeping out of sight until the trial." "You've spoken with him?" Rebecca's voice sharpened with interest. "What did he say about his disappearance?" "Claims Gerald tried to kill him that night. He's been gathering evidence against the Blackwoods for 2 years, working with Marshal Collins." Samuel watched his sister's reaction carefully. "Does that align with what you've heard?" Rebecca's expression remained carefully neutral. "Partially. Collins did mention a confidential informant providing information about the Blackwoods operation. Never named him, though." "And Clara, did you tell her about her husband's resurrection?" "Yes, she's back at the brothel now, maintaining her cover while caring for Ruby." Samuel moved toward the door. "We need to get to Jenkins before the trial starts. If he can corroborate James's evidence—" "It's not that simple," Rebecca interrupted. "Gerald's men are under strict orders. No one sees Jenkins before the trial. They're taking no chances." "Then we'll need a distraction." Samuel considered their options. The town hall has a back entrance through the kitchen used for community suppers. If someone created a commotion at the front during the pretrial preparations, I can handle that, Rebecca offered. A hysterical woman claiming her brother is being unjustly accused should draw sufficient attention. Samuel nodded, appreciating his sister's quick thinking. Good. I'll slip in through the back, find Jenkins, and see what he knows. He checked his pocket watch. We have 40 minutes before the trial begins. Meet at the church afterward if we get separated. As they finalized their plan, Samuel debated whether to share his lingering concerns about James Winter's convenient return. Something about the timing felt orchestrated, as if James had been waiting for this precise moment to reappear. Rebecca, he began cautiously, does anything about James's return seem convenient to you? His sister studied him, her perceptive gaze uncomfortably knowing. You mean besides showing up just as you've grown attached to his widow? Samuel's jaw tightened. This isn't about Clara, it's about the investigation. Isn't it? Rebecca's voice softened slightly. I've seen how you look at her, Samuel, the way you haven't looked at anyone since Sarah died. That's not relevant, Samuel insisted, though the accuracy of her observation discomfited him. What matters is whether James Winters is being truthful about his motives for returning now. Rebecca considered this, setting aside the personal aspect. I admit the timing is suspect. If he's been working with Collins for months, why not coordinate his return with the federal marshals? Why now when Gerald and Nathaniel are both in town? Exactly, Samuel said, relieved she understood his concern. It's almost as if he wanted to confront them himself, Rebecca finished, which suggests a personal vendetta beyond simply bringing them to justice. Or worse, Samuel added grimly, that he's working with them and his return is part of some larger scheme we don't yet understand. Rebecca's expression turned thoughtful. It would explain how he survived that night when everyone, including Sullivan, identified a body as his. We need to proceed cautiously, Samuel decided. Get to Jenkins, hear his side of the story before making any final judgments about James. With their plan set, they separated Rebecca, heading directly to the town hall to prepare her distraction, while Samuel took a circuitous route to avoid being seen, particularly by Gerald's men, who would recognize him as a potential threat. The town hall, once a grand building by frontier standards, now showing signs of neglect, like much of Willow Creek, was already busy with activity when Samuel approached from the rear. Several horses were tethered nearby, including an elegant bay that likely belonged to Judge Howard. Through a side window, Samuel glimpsed Gerald and Nathaniel Blackwood in conversation, their heads bent close together in apparent disagreement. The kitchen entrance was unguarded as Samuel had expected. Most of Gerald's men would be focused on the main hall and Jenkins's holding area. He slipped inside, finding the kitchen empty, save for an elderly woman preparing coffee for the court proceedings. Court don't start for another half hour, mister, she said without looking up from her task. Judge likes his coffee fresh before he begins. Actually, I'm looking for the prisoner, Samuel replied, deciding directness might serve better than subterfuge with someone unlikely to be in Gerald's confidence. Jenkins, I'm his legal representation. The woman looked up, squinting at him skeptically. Since when does a drifter charged with theft get fancy legal representation? Judge Howard's orders, Samuel lied smoothly, wants everything by the book for this trial. Too many witnesses. She considered this, then nodded toward a door at the far end of the kitchen. Down those stairs. But Floyd's guarding him, and he don't let nobody past without Mr. Blackwood's say-so. I'm sure we can come to an understanding, Samuel replied, patting his pocket where coins jingled suggestively. The woman shrugged, returning to her coffee preparation. Your funeral, mister. Samuel descended the stairs silently, finding himself in a dimly lit corridor that ran beneath the town hall. At the far end, a burly man, presumably Floyd, sat on a stool outside a door reinforced with iron bands, clearly a makeshift cell. Before Samuel could determine the best approach, a commotion erupted from upstairs. Rebecca's distraction had begun. Floyd looked up at the ceiling, frowning at the sound of running feet and raised voices. What the hell, he muttered, rising from his stool. Samuel seized the opportunity, stepping into the corridor as if he belonged there. Floyd, Gerald sent me to relieve you, he called, keeping his voice authoritative. Trouble upstairs. Some woman causing a scene. Floyd hesitated, suspicious but clearly curious about the disturbance. Gerald didn't say nothing about relief. Last-minute decision, Samuel replied, continuing his approach. Judge Howard's worried about appearances. Wants more men visible during the trial, less hidden away down here. This appealed to Floyd's apparent desire to be where the action was. About time, he grumbled. Been sitting here since dawn. He handed Samuel a ring of keys. Prisoners secured, shackled to the wall. Don't open the door unless Gerald or the judge comes down personally. Understood, Samuel assured him, taking the keys. You'd better hurry. Sounds like they could use help up there. Floyd nodded and lumbered up the stairs, leaving Samuel alone in the corridor. The moment he disappeared, Samuel unlocked the cell door, slipping inside quickly. The room was small and windowless, lit only by a single oil lamp that cast long shadows across the stone walls. In the far corner, a man sat hunched on a narrow cot, his wrists indeed shackled to an iron ring embedded in the wall. He looked up as Samuel entered, revealing a face that, despite being bruised and gaunt, bore a striking resemblance to James Winters. Jenkins, Samuel asked, though he was already certain of the man's identity. Who's asking? Jenkins replied warily, his voice hoarse from disuse or mistreatment. Samuel Foster, Pinkerton. Samuel approached slowly, keeping his hands visible. I'm investigating the Blackwoods trafficking operation. I believe you have information that could help. Jenkins's expression shifted from wariness to bitter amusement. Bit late for that, ain't it? Trial's in half an hour. By noon, I'll be swinging from the same gallows as poor Reynolds. Not if I can help it, Samuel assured him, kneeling to examine the shackles. Without the key, removing them would be difficult but not impossible. James Winters is alive. He's here in Willow Creek. Jenkins's head snapped up, genuine shock in his expression. James alive? That's not possible. I saw him go into the creek that night. Saw him go under. Yet he's here, Samuel confirmed, working on the lock with a slender pick from his pocket. Claims he's been gathering evidence against the Blackwoods for 2 years, working with Marshal Collins. Collins, Jenkins repeated, frowning. Never heard James mention that name. And I was his main contact until... He trailed off, his expression darkening with memory. Until what? Samuel prompted, still working on the shackle. Until the flood, Jenkins said quietly. We were meeting by the creek. James had discovered ledgers in Gerald's store records of their trafficking operation, names, dates, payments, everything needed to bring them down. What happened that night? Samuel asked, sensing they were approaching crucial information. We were supposed to meet at midnight. I brought additional evidence letters between Nathaniel and Judge Howard discussing their operation. But someone followed me. Jenkins' voice dropped even lower. Gerald and 2 of his men. They had guns. The first shackle sprung open. Samuel moved to the second as Jenkins continued, the words pouring out as if he'd been waiting 2 years to share this burden. They shot at us. James was hit shoulder, I think. We both fell into the creek trying to escape. It was flooding from the spring rains current, stronger than anything I'd ever seen. Jenkins rubbed his wrist where the shackle had been. Last I saw, James was being swept downstream. I managed to grab onto a tree branch, pulled myself out further down. But a body was found, Samuel pointed out, identified as James Winters. Jenkins nodded grimly. That wasn't James. That was Willis, one of Gerald's men who fell in during the struggle. I saw Gerald and his remaining man find the body the next morning. They stripped it, dressed it in James's coat that had come off in the creek. Made sure it would be identified as him. The second shackle opened. Samuel helped Jenkins to his feet, the man's legs unsteady after hours of confinement. If what you're saying's true, Samuel said slowly, then James Winters has been missing, presumed dead, for 2 years. Yet he claims to have been working actively against the Blackwoods during that time. One of us is lying, Jenkins concluded, and I've got no reason to. They're planning to hang me today regardless. Not if I can help it, Samuel repeated, more determined now. Can you walk? Jenkins nodded, though he swayed slightly. Where are we going? First out of here, then to the church where we can regroup safely. Samuel peered out the cell door, confirming the corridor remained empty. Once we've secured your safety, we'll deal with the question of James Winters' true intentions. They had just reached the stairs when the kitchen door above opened, footsteps descending rapidly. Samuel pulled Jenkins back into the shadows, drawing his revolver. Foster, Rebecca's voice called softly. Are you down here? Samuel relaxed slightly, stepping forward. Here, with Jenkins. Rebecca appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her expression urgent. We need to go, now. Gerald's men are searching the building. My distraction worked too well. They've postponed the trial by an hour while they secure the premises. Is the back exit still clear? Samuel asked, supporting Jenkins, who was growing paler by the minute. For now, but it won't be for long. Rebecca eyed Jenkins with professional assessment. He needs medical attention. Clara, Samuel decided. She's at the brothel treating Ruby. We'll take him there first, then move them both to the church once it's safe. They made their way cautiously up the stairs, Rebecca leading Samuel, supporting Jenkins, whose strength was clearly fading. The kitchen was empty, the coffee maker apparently having delivered her brew to the court officials in the main hall. Outside, they stuck to back alleys and service paths, avoiding the main street where Gerald's men would be patrolling. Jenkins stumbled several times, his breathing increasingly labored. He's worse than he looks, Rebecca murmured to Samuel as they paused in the shadow of a livery stable. Fever, possibly internal injuries. They worked him over pretty thoroughly. Samuel nodded grimly. Jenkins' testimony could destroy the Blackwoods. They would have ensured he was in no condition to speak at trial, making his inevitable conviction and execution appear just to the townspeople. The brothel's back entrance was unguarded when they arrived, most of the establishment's occupants still asleep after their night's work. Rebecca scouted ahead, returning to report that Clara was still with Ruby in the upstairs room at the end of the hall. They managed to get Jenkins upstairs without being seen, though. The effort clearly cost him the last of his strength. By the time they reached Ruby's room, he was barely conscious, his skin burning with fever. Clara looked up in surprise as they entered, her professional demeanor immediately taking over at the sight of Jenkins' condition. On the bed, she directed, moving Ruby carefully to make room. What happened? Gerald's men, Samuel explained succinctly. He's James's contact from the night of the flood. Claims James was shot, fell into the creek. The body found was one of Gerald's men, deliberately misidentified. Clara's hands stilled momentarily as she processed this information, then resumed their efficient assessment of Jenkins's injuries. He has several broken ribs, extensive bruising, and a high fever. Possibly pneumonia from the damp cell. She looked up at Samuel. He needs immediate treatment. Do what you can, Samuel urged. Rebecca will stay with you while I find James. If Jenkins is telling the truth, James has been lying about his activities these past 2 years, which raises serious questions about his motives for returning now. Clara's expression reflected the turmoil Samuel knew she must be feeling, hope that her husband was alive, warring with the possibility that he might not be the man she remembered. Be careful, she said finally. If James isn't what he seems, I will, Samuel promised. Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but Rebecca or myself. As he turned to leave, Clara caught his arm. Samuel? She hesitated, clearly struggling with what to say. Whatever we discover about James, thank you for everything. Samuel nodded, unable to formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much of his conflicted emotions. Instead, he squeezed her hand briefly before departing, the touch communicating what words could not. Outside, Willow Creek seemed deceptively normal. Storekeepers, sweeping porches, women gathering at the well, children playing in the dusty street. But Samuel noted the increased presence of Gerald's men moving with purpose through the town, clearly searching for Jenkins. The Rusty Nail was busier now, the delay in the trial having driven many potential spectators to seek refreshment while they waited. Samuel entered cautiously, scanning the room for James. The corner table where they had left him was empty. Samuel approached the bartender, keeping his voice casual. Looking for a friend, medium height, light brown hair, military bearing. Seen him, the bartender shrugged. Left about 20 minutes ago. Seemed in a hurry, heading toward the general store, I think. Samuel thanked him and exited quickly, concern growing. If James had gone to confront Gerald directly, it could jeopardize everything: the investigation, Jenkins's safety, even Clara's position. As he approached the general store, Samuel heard raised voices from within. Drawing his revolver, he moved to a window, peering carefully inside. The scene that greeted him confirmed his worst suspicions. James Winters stood facing Gerald and Nathaniel Blackwood, a gun in his hand pointed steadily at Gerald's chest. Judge Howard was seated nearby, his face pale with fear or anger. It was difficult to tell. 2 years, James was saying, his voice cold with controlled fury. 2 years I've waited for this moment, to see your face when you realized your plan failed. James, be reasonable, Gerald replied. his usual bluster replaced by careful placation. Whatever you think happened in that night, I know what happened, James interrupted. You tried to kill me to protect your operation. When that failed, you identified another body as mine to buy time, and you've been terrorizing my wife ever since. Gerald spread his hands in a gesture of innocence. Business is business, James. You owed debts. I collected. Nothing personal. It became personal when you put a bullet in me, James countered, his gun unwavering. When you left me for dead in that creek. Samuel assessed the situation rapidly. James appeared to be acting out of personal vengeance rather than as part of an investigation. There were no marshals, no formal arrest in progress, just a man with a gun and a grudge, however justified. If James killed Gerald in cold blood, any legal case against the Blackwoods operation would be compromised. Justice would be replaced by vigilantism, and Clara would be left to bear the consequences. Samuel had to intervene, but doing so would expose himself. Before he could decide on the best approach, movement near the store's back room caught his eye. A figure emerged slowly, revolver drawn. Sheriff Sullivan, his face bruised, his uniform torn and muddy, but very much alive. Sullivan's appearance changed the dynamics instantly. James focused on Gerald, and Nathaniel hadn't noticed the sheriff's entrance. Gerald, however, had his eyes flicked briefly to Sullivan, a subtle signal passing between them. Something was wrong. Sullivan's stance, the way he held his weapon, it wasn't the posture of a lawman making an arrest, but of someone preparing to eliminate a threat. And that threat was James. Samuel reacted instinctively. Crashing through the door, he shouted a warning, "James, down!" James dropped just as Sullivan fired the bullet, passing through the space where his head had been a moment before. In the ensuing chaos, Gerald lunged for a shotgun behind the counter, while Nathaniel drew a concealed derringer from his coat. Samuel fired twice in rapid succession, one shot knocking the shotgun from Gerald's hands, the second striking Nathaniel's shoulder, causing him to drop his derringer with a cry of pain. James had rolled behind a barrel of flour, his own gun now trained on Sullivan. "Sheriff, what the hell?" Sullivan's expression was a mask of cold determination. "Sorry, James, but some secrets need to stay buried." "What secrets?" Samuel demanded, keeping his revolver trained on Gerald, who was nursing his injured hand. "What was your stake in this, Sullivan?" A grim smile twisted the sheriff's weathered face. "You really think a small-town sheriff survives on his salary? The Blackwoods have been supplementing my income for years. In return, I look the other way on certain business matters." "Like trafficking," James spat. "Like murder." "Business?" Sullivan repeated, echoing Gerald's earlier justification. "Nothing personal." "Well, what about your son?" Samuel asked, watching Sullivan's reaction closely. "Was that business too?" A flash of genuine pain crossed Sullivan's features. "Michael made his choice, threatened to expose everything unless I helped him pay his gambling debts. Made himself a liability." "So you let the Blackwoods take him," Samuel concluded, disgust evident in his voice. "Your own son." "Like I said," Sullivan replied, his voice hardening. "Business." The standoff continued, tension crackling in the air. 4 armed men, multiple angles of fire, innocent bystanders potentially in the line of fire outside it, was a volatile situation with no clean resolution. "This ends now," James declared, his gun steady despite the sweat beading on his forehead. "Gerald and Nathaniel Blackwood, Judge Howard, Sheriff Sullivan, you're all going to face justice for your crimes. And who's going to administer this justice?" Gerald mocked, regaining some of his bravado. "You, a dead man, Foster, a drifter with no official standing. There's no law here but what we decide." "That's where you're wrong," came a new voice from the doorway. Clara stood there, her medical bag in one hand, a derringer, likely Rebecca's, in the other. Behind her, several townspeople had gathered, drawn by the commotion. "Jenkins is awake," she announced, her voice carrying clearly through the store. "He's provided a sworn statement about the night of the flood, the attempted murder of James Winters, and the body that was deliberately misidentified. He's also detailed the Blackwoods trafficking operation, including names, dates, and locations." Samuel noted with admiration how she commanded the space, her nursing experience evident in her authoritative tone. "The evidence has been secured," she continued. "Copies are already on their way to the territorial governor and federal authorities." It was a bluff. Samuel knew Jenkins was conscious, but barely strong enough to speak, let alone provide a sworn statement. But it was delivered with such conviction that doubt flickered across Gerald's face. You're lying, Nathaniel said, clutching his wounded shoulder. No one would believe a drifter facing trial for theft. They'll believe him when his testimony is corroborated by this, James replied, producing a small, leather-bound book from his coat. The original ledger from 2 years ago. Names, dates, payments, everything. I managed to hold on to it when I went into the creek. Gerald's face paled. That's impossible. We searched the entire area. Not impossible, James countered. Just improbable. Like surviving a gunshot wound in a flood. Like returning from the dead to see justice done. The balance of power had shifted palpably. Sullivan seemed to sense it, his grip on his revolver tightening as he prepared for a desperate final play. Samuel saw the intention in the sheriff's eyes a split second before he acted. "Clara, down!" he shouted, throwing himself toward her as Sullivan swung his gun in her direction. Two shots rang out simultaneously, James firing at Sullivan at Clara. Samuel felt a searing pain in his side as he collided with Clara, knocking her to the floor behind a display of canned goods. Sullivan staggered backward, James's bullet having found its mark in his chest. He looked down at the spreading stain with something like surprise, then crumpled to the floor, his revolver clattering beside him. In the moment of shock that followed, Gerald made his move, diving for Sullivan's fallen weapon. James was faster, kicking it away and pressing his gun to Gerald's temple. "Don't," he warned, his voice deadly quiet. "Give me a reason, Gerald. Please." Clara was at Samuel's side instantly, her hands already opening her medical bag. "You're hit," she said, her voice professional despite the fear in her eyes. Samuel grimaced, feeling warm blood seeping through his shirt. "Just a graze," he assured her, though the pain suggested otherwise. "Check Sullivan first." Clara hesitated, then moved to the fallen sheriff. After a brief examination, she shook her head. "He's gone." Outside, a commotion was growing as more townspeople gathered, drawn by the gunshots. Among them, Samuel spotted Rebecca, her expression alert and assessing. "James," Clara called, her voice steady despite the chaos. "This has to end legally, not with more bloodshed." James looked down at Gerald, conflict evident in his expression, the desire for personal vengeance warring with the need for proper justice. After a long moment, he stepped back, lowering his gun slightly. "You're right," he acknowledged. "They'll face trial for their crimes, all of them." Rebecca entered, taking in the situation with a quick glance. "Marshal Collins just arrived with federal deputies," she announced. "They're securing the brothel and other Blackwood properties now." Relief washed over James's face. Perfect timing. He turned to Gerald, who remained on the floor, his earlier bravado replaced by the sullen resignation of a cornered predator. "Your operation is finished, Gerald. Your brothers, too. And all those people you've hurt over the years, they'll finally see justice done." As federal marshals entered the store, taking control of the situation with practiced efficiency, Samuel felt the tension that had sustained him begin to ebb, replaced by the insistent throb of his wound and a bone-deep weariness. Clara returned to his side, helping him to a chair. "Let me see," she insisted gently, pulling aside his bloodied shirt to examine the bullet wound in his side. "How bad?" he asked, wincing as she probed the injury. "Through and through," she replied, professional assessment momentarily masking deeper emotions. "Missed anything vital, but you've lost blood. You'll need stitches and rest." "Jenkins," Samuel asked, trying to focus through the growing fog of pain and exhaustion. "Stable for now." Rebecca moved him to the church as planned. Clara began cleaning the wound with steady hands. "He's asking to speak with you when you're able." Samuel nodded, watching as James conferred with Marshal Collins, the two men clearly familiar with each other. Another piece confirming Jenkins's account, James had indeed been working with federal authorities, though perhaps not for the full 2 years he had claimed. As Clara worked, Samuel found himself studying her face, the delicate furrow of concentration between her brows, the firm set of her mouth, the compassion in her eyes despite the trauma of the day's events. She had shown remarkable courage and adaptability throughout, transforming from grieving widow to active participant in bringing down the criminal enterprise that had claimed her husband's life, or so she had believed. And now that husband had returned, creating a complex emotional equation that Samuel had no right to involve himself in, despite the feelings that had grown between them during their days together. "Clara," he began, uncertain what he even wanted to say. She looked up from her work, her eyes meeting his with a depth of understanding that took his breath away. "Not now," she said softly. "There will be time for everything once you're stable." Samuel nodded, accepting her prioritization. The immediate crisis was resolving. Gerald Nathaniel and Judge Howard were being led away in handcuffs. Marshall Collins was organizing the collection of evidence. Townspeople were being interviewed as potential witnesses. The future, Clara's future, in his own, and whatever intersection might or might not exist between them, would have to wait until the present was secured and the wounds of the past properly addressed. As darkness began to encroach on the edges of his vision, Samuel surrendered to Clara's capable hands, trusting her to see him through this immediate crisis, as she had trusted him to help her confront the dangers that had surrounded her. The last thing he saw before consciousness slipped away was James watching them from across the room, his expression unreadable as he observed his wife tending to the man who had protected her in his absence. Samuel awoke to the soft glow of lamplight and the familiar scent of Clara's cabin. For a moment, disorientation clouded his mind. How had he gotten here? The last he remembered was the general store, Sullivan's betrayal, the gunshot. "Easy," came Clara's voice from nearby. "You've been unconscious for several hours." Samuel turned his head carefully, finding Clara seated beside the bed. Her bed, he realized, not his usual place by the hearth. She looked tired but composed, a book open in her lap, a cup of tea cooling on the small table beside her. "Water," he rasped, his throat painfully dry. Clara helped him sit up slightly, supporting his head as he drank from the cup she offered. The movement sent fresh pain lancing through his side, reminding him of Sullivan's bullet. "What happened?" he asked once he had drunk his fill. "After I passed out." "Marshall Collins took control of the situation," Clara explained, setting the cup aside. "Gerald Nathaniel and Judge Howard are being held in the territorial prison awaiting trial. Several of Gerald's men have already confessed, hoping for leniency. Jenkins? Recovering, still weak, but his fever broke this morning." A small smile touched Clara's lips. "He's quite determined to testify against the Blackwoods despite his condition." Samuel nodded, relieved the key witness had survived. "Rebecca, gone to telegraph our success to Pinkerton headquarters. She said to tell you she'll return tomorrow." Clara hesitated, then added, "She's quite remarkable, your sister. Skilled in ways most women aren't permitted to be." "She had to be," Samuel replied, memories of their difficult childhood briefly surfacing. "After our parents died, after Sarah," he trailed off, the name still painful to speak, even after 8 years. Clara's expression softened with understanding. "Your sister, the one who was trafficked." Samuel nodded, surprised she had made the connection. "Rebecca told you?" "No," Clara replied. "But I've watched you, Samuel. The way you react to certain things, your dedication to this case beyond professional duty. I recognize the signs of a personal vendetta." She paused, adding gently, "I'm a nurse. I've learned to read people's pain even when they try to hide it." Samuel didn't respond immediately, unaccustomed to being so transparently seen. Finally, he asked the question foremost in his mind, "And James, where is he?" A shadow crossed Clara's face. "At the hotel in town. Marshall Collins needed his continued assistance with processing evidence and taking statements." There was something in her tone Samuel couldn't quite identify, not exactly distance, but a certain reserve when speaking of her returned husband. "He confirmed Jenkins's account," Clara continued. "He was shot that night, fell into the creek. The current carried him nearly 3 miles downstream before he managed to grab onto a fallen tree. He was unconscious for days afterward, cared for by a trapper who found him half drowned on the riverbank." "In the 2 years since," Samuel prompted gently. Clara's gaze dropped to her hands. "He spent the first 6 months recovering, then began gathering evidence against the Blackwoods. Made contact with Marshall Collins about 8 months ago." She looked up, meeting Samuel's eyes directly. "He didn't lie about working against them, but he did lie about how long and other things." "What other thing?" "He could have contacted me," Clara said, the hurt finally showing through her composed exterior. "Once he connected with Collins, there were secure ways to let me know he was alive. He chose not to." Samuel weighed his next words carefully. "Did he explain why?" "He said he was protecting me," Clara replied, a hint of bitterness entering her voice. "That if Gerald suspected James was alive, I would be in greater danger." She shook her head slightly. "But there's more he's not saying. I can feel it." Samuel understood her doubts. Despite James's apparent dedication to bringing down the Blackwoods, his decision to let Clara believe him dead for 2 years, especially once he had federal protection, suggested motivations beyond mere safety concerns. "What will you do now?" Samuel asked the question that had been hovering between them since James's return, finally spoken aloud. Clara was silent for a long moment, her gaze drifting to the window where afternoon light filtered through the curtains. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "2 days ago, I was a widow rebuilding my life. Now my husband has returned from the dead, a criminal conspiracy has been exposed, and everything I thought I knew has been upended." Her eyes returned to Samuel. "Including how I feel about certain things." The implication hung in the air between them, neither willing to address it directly, not yet, not with so many unresolved questions surrounding James's return and Clara's own conflicted emotions. "You should rest," Clara said, eventually rising from her chair. "Your body needs time to heal." As she turned to leave, Samuel caught her hand. "Clara." He paused, searching for words adequate to the complexity of their situation. "Whatever you decide, whatever path you choose, I understand." Her fingers tightened briefly around his. "Do you?" "Because I'm not sure I do." With that quiet admission, she gently withdrew her hand and moved to the hearth, busying herself with the kettle, a familiar routine that seemed to ground her amid the emotional turbulence of recent days. Samuel watched her, acutely aware of the shifting dynamics between them. What had begun as a professional arrangement protection in exchange for a base of operations had evolved into something neither had anticipated or sought, something that now had to be reconciled with James's unexpected return and all the complications it entailed. Rest, Clara had advised. But Samuel knew sleep would be elusive, his mind too full of questions without answers, possibilities without certainties, and feelings he had no right to acknowledge given the circumstances. Outside, the sun continued its westward journey, casting long shadows across the land, much like the shadows of the past that had suddenly reasserted themselves in Clara's life and by extension in Samuel's own. 3 days passed in a strange limbo of recovery and waiting. Samuel's wound healed steadily under Clara's expert care, while news filtered in from town about the ongoing dismantling of the Blackwoods operation. James visited once the encounter stiff with unspoken tensions. He expressed appropriate gratitude for Samuel's protection of Clara during his absence, reported on the investigation's progress, and departed with the formality that suggested he was as uncertain of his footing in this new reality as everyone else. Rebecca came and went, dividing her time between assisting Marshal Collins and checking on her brother's recovery. During one such visit, she brought news that Jenkins had provided a comprehensive statement detailing the full extent of the Blackwoods trafficking operation, names, locations, and crucially the fate of the missing veterans, including Sullivan's son Michael. Most were sent to mining operations in Colorado Territory, she reported, seated at Clara's small table while Samuel sat propped up in a chair by the hearth. Forced labor under brutal conditions. Some died, some escaped. Collins has deputies searching for survivors now. "And Michael Sullivan?" Samuel asked, remembering the sheriff's callous dismissal of his own son's fate. Rebecca's expression darkened. "Dead. Tried to organize an escape 6 months ago. The guards made an example of him." Clara, who had been listening quietly as she prepared dinner, paused in her work. "How many victims total?" 28 confirmed so far, Rebecca replied grimly. 8 veterans, 20 women and girls. And those are just the ones we can document. The actual number is likely higher. Samuel absorbed this information with a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow, and satisfaction that the Blackwoods would face justice for their crimes, sorrow for the lives destroyed along the way. "What about Sarah?" he asked quietly, the question he had carried throughout the investigation finally finding voice. "Any mention of her in their records?" Rebecca met his gaze with gentle compassion. "No direct mention, but Jenkins identified Nathaniel as having recruited women in Denver during the period Sarah disappeared." She hesitated, then added, "It's circumstantial, but it's the closest connection we've found." Samuel nodded, accepting this partial answer as perhaps the most definitive one he would ever receive. Sarah's fate had driven his pursuit of trafficking operations for 8 years. The possibility that the Blackwoods had been involved in her disappearance had been his personal motivation for accepting this assignment. "What happens now?" Clara asked, directing her question to Rebecca. "With the investigation, I mean." "Marshal Collins will escort the prisoners to Denver for trial next week," Rebecca explained. "Jenkins and James will testify as key witnesses. After that," she shrugged, "on to the next case, I suppose." There are always more operations like the Black Woods to uncover. The inevitable progression of their work, finishing one case only to move on to the next, had never bothered Samuel before. It was the nature of their profession, the endless pursuit of justice in a world that seemed determined to thwart it at every turn. But now the thought of moving on, of leaving Willow Creek, of leaving Clara, created an unexpected hollow feeling in his chest. "You'll be leaving soon, then?" Clara observed, her tone carefully neutral. "Once Samuel is fit to travel," Rebecca confirmed, glancing between them with perceptive eyes. "Unless there's reason to stay longer." The question behind her statement hung in the air, addressing the unspoken tension that had pervaded the cabin since James's return. Clara returned to her cooking without responding, the subtle set of her shoulders conveying an internal struggle she wasn't ready to voice. That evening, after Rebecca had departed and dinner had been cleared away, Clara sat beside Samuel near the hearth, the familiar routine of checking his wound providing structure to an otherwise uncertain interaction. "It's healing well," she noted, applying fresh bandages with practiced hands. "Another week and you should be able to travel without risk of reopening it." "Clara," Samuel began the impending departure, forcing him to address what they had been avoiding. "About James?" "Not yet," she interrupted softly. "Please." Samuel respected her reluctance, understanding that she needed time to reconcile the husband she had mourned with the man who had returned, a man whose choices over the past 2 years had revealed aspects of his character she was still processing. They sat in silence for a time, the crackling of the fire and the distant calls of night birds, the only sounds disturbing the quiet. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I thought James was dead, I buried not just him, but a part of myself, the part that believed in new beginnings, in possibilities beyond grief and survival." She stared into the flames, her profile illuminated by their warm glow. "These past days with you, that part began to awaken again." Samuel remained silent, sensing she needed to articulate these thoughts without interruption. "Now James is back, and I should be overjoyed. A miracle, people keep calling it." A sad smile touched her lips. "But miracles aren't supposed to bring confusion and doubt. They're supposed to bring clarity and peace." "What are you saying, Clara?" Samuel asked gently. She turned to face him fully, her eyes reflecting both resolve and uncertainty. "I'm saying I don't know who James is anymore. 2 years is a long time. We've both changed. And his choice to let me believe him dead, to let me mourn and struggle alone." She shook her head. "It reveals something about him I'm not sure I can reconcile with the man I married. People make difficult choices in desperate circumstances." Samuel offered, not defending James's actions, but acknowledging their complexity. "Sometimes the wrong choices for what seem like the right reasons." "I know," Clara acknowledged, "and part of me understands his justification. But understanding isn't the same as accepting." She reached out, her fingers lightly touching the bandage on Samuel's side. "You took a bullet meant for me without hesitation. James let me believe he was dead for 2 years to protect me. Both acts of protection, but so fundamentally different in what they reveal about the men behind them." The implication of her comparison hung between them, too significant to dismiss, yet too delicate to address directly, not while James's return and all its ramifications remained unresolved. "What will you do?" Samuel asked, echoing his question from days earlier. This time Clara's answer held more certainty. "I need to speak with James properly. Not about the investigation or the Blackwoods, but about us, what happened, what he chose, and why. Only then can I decide whether there's a future for us to rebuild." Samuel nodded, respecting her need for closure one way or another. "And if there isn't?" Clara's gaze met his, unflinching in its honesty. "Then I move forward with what I've learned about myself these past months. That I'm stronger than I knew. That my work as a healer still matters. And that—" She paused, vulnerability showing through her composed exterior. "That connection is still possible, even after great loss." The weight of her words, what they implied about possibilities, neither had dared articulate directly, settled between them, like a fragile, precious thing not to be grasped at, but acknowledged with care. Before Samuel could respond, a knock at the door broke the moment. Clara rose to answer it, revealing James standing on the porch, his expression solemn in the fading evening light. "Clara, he said, removing his hat. "I was hoping we might talk." His gaze moved past her to Samuel, acknowledging his presence with a slight nod. "Privately, if possible." Clara glanced back at Samuel, a silent communication passing between them. He nodded slightly, understanding this conversation was necessary for her to move forward, whatever direction that might take. "I'll check on Jenkins at the church," Samuel offered, rising carefully from his chair, wincing slightly at the pull of his wound. "Give you two some time." "You shouldn't be walking that far yet," Clara protested, her concern genuine. "I'll be fine," Samuel assured her. "The fresh air will do me good." As he gathered his coat and hat, the awkwardness of the situation, two men connected to the same woman, one a husband returned from presumed death, the other. Whatever Samuel had become to Clara during their time together hung heavy in the small cabin. James stepped aside to let Samuel pass the two men, exchanging a look that contained both respect and wariness. Neither spoke, but an understanding passed between them. Nonetheless, whatever happened next would be Clara's choice, not a competition to be won. Outside, the evening air was cool against Samuel's face, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. He began the walk toward town slowly, his side aching, but not unbearably so. The physical discomfort was almost welcome, providing distraction from the more complex pain of potentially losing something he had never officially had. The abandoned church loomed ahead, its broken spire silhouetted against the twilight. Inside, Jenkins would be resting, recovering from his ordeal, while preparing to testify against the Blackwoods. Samuel would check on him as promised, perhaps discuss final details of the case, the professional routine a comfort amid personal uncertainty. But first he paused at the crest of the small hill that separated Clara's cabin from Willow Creek proper, looking back at the warm light spilling from her windows. Within those walls, decisions were being made that would shape multiple futures, Clara's, James's, and by extension, Samuel's own. Whatever the outcome, Samuel realized Willow Creek had changed him. The case that had begun as another pursuit in his ongoing mission to find justice for Sarah had become something more personal, more transformative. He had arrived a solitary hunter with a singular purpose. He would depart. What? That remained to be seen. With a last glance at the distant cabin, Samuel continued toward town, each step forward, a reminder that life rarely followed the paths we envisioned for ourselves. Sometimes it led us to unexpected crossroads, where the only certainty was that nothing would be the same once choices were made and roads taken. Behind him in Clara's cabin, those choices were being faced by a woman who had lost and found, and perhaps lost again, and by a man who had returned to discover that coming back from the dead didn't guarantee reclaiming the life he had left behind. Ahead, the church waited, a symbol of both destruction and potential renewal, much like Willow Creek itself, and the lives of those who had been caught in the web of secrets and crimes that had defined it for too long. The stars continued to emerge above, ancient and indifferent to human concerns, yet somehow comforting in their constancy. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would still shine down on Willow Creek, on Clara's cabin, on the road ahead, whatever direction it might take. 1 week later, Samuel stood on the porch of Clara's cabin, his bag packed and waiting by the door. His wound had healed enough for travel, the pain reduced to a dull ache that flared only with sudden movements. Inside, Clara was gathering a few final items for Jenkins, who would be departing on the same stagecoach as Samuel and Rebecca, bound for Denver to testify at the Blackwoods trial. The past week had brought significant changes to Willow Creek. With Gerald Nathaniel and Judge Howard removed, the town had begun a tentative process of rebuilding. A temporary sheriff had been appointed from a neighboring settlement. Businesses previously controlled by the Blackwoods were being reorganized, and the brothel's residents had been offered legitimate employment or assistance relocating to larger towns where opportunities were more plentiful. Ruby had succumbed to her illness 3 days earlier, a peaceful passing eased by Clara's care and Emma's devoted presence. They had buried her in the small cemetery behind the abandoned church, the first funeral in years, not controlled by Gerald Blackwood or presided over by Judge Howard. Samuel watched the morning mist rising from the distant creek, his thoughts on the conversation he had overheard between Clara and James the night before. He hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but returning early from a final meeting with Marshal Collins, he had approached the cabin as their voices carried through the open window. "I understand why you felt you had to stay away," Clara had said, her tone measured but firm. "What I can't accept is that you chose to continue that separation even after connecting with federal authorities. There were secure ways to contact me, James. You chose not to use them." "I was protecting you," James had insisted, the defense he had maintained throughout. "No," Clara had countered with quiet certainty. "You were protecting the investigation. You prioritize bringing down the Blackwoods over everything else, over us, over my right to know you were alive. A lengthy silence had followed, broken finally by James's sigh of resignation. You're right, he had admitted. After nearly dying, after losing everything, taking down Gerald, and his operation became consuming, an obsession that justified any sacrifice. His voice had lowered, filled with regret, including sacrificing your peace of mind. I convinced myself it was for your protection, but the truth is, I wasn't thinking about you at all. I was thinking about justice, revenge, my mission. And now, Clara had asked, with the Blackwoods facing trial, your mission nearly complete. Who are you now, James, and what do you want? Another silence then. I want a chance to find out, with you if possible. Samuel had moved away, then not wanting to intrude further on their private reckoning. But the exchange had confirmed what he had suspected. James's choice to remain dead had been driven less by concern for Clara's safety and more by single-minded dedication to his cause. A dedication Samuel recognized all too well from his own pursuit of justice for Sarah. The cabin door opened behind him, pulling Samuel from his thoughts. Clara emerged, a small package in her hands. Medicine for Jenkins, she explained, adding it to Samuel's bag. Enough to last until Denver. The federal doctor can take over his care from there. Samuel nodded, noting the shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of a restless night. Where's James this morning? At the hotel, finalizing arrangements with Marshal Collins. Clara moved to stand beside him at the porch railing, her gaze following his to the distant mist. He'll be traveling to Denver as well, though on a later stage. Samuel absorbed this information, wondering what it signified about their conversations and whatever decisions had been reached. And you, what will you do now? Clara was silent for a moment, her fingers tracing the grain of the wooden railing. Ruby's death reminded me why I became a nurse in the first place. To ease suffering, to heal when possible, to provide comfort when healing isn't an option. She turned to face him. Willow Creek needs a Dr. Samuel, or at least someone with medical training. I'm going to reopen my practice. Here, Samuel couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. Even with everything that's happened. A small smile touched Clara's lips, especially because of everything that's happened. This town has been sick for a long time, poisoned by the Blackwoods' influence. Now it has a chance to heal, but healing takes time and care. Her expression grew more serious. I know what that process requires better than most. And James, Samuel asked the question he had been avoiding, finally spoken aloud. Clara's gaze dropped briefly before meeting his again, with characteristic directness. James and I have agreed to give each other space. He has his testimony to deliver, arrangements to make with the marshals about his future role, and I have a practice to establish, a life to rebuild. She hesitated, then added, We've both changed too much to simply resume where we left off 2 years ago. Whether those changes are compatible remains to be seen. Samuel nodded, understanding the complexity of their situation. 2 years of separation, one believing the other dead, one consumed by a mission of justice, had created a gulf not easily bridged by reunion alone. What about you, Samuel? Clara asked, turning the question back on him. What will you do after Denver? Another case for Pinkerton. Most likely, he replied, though the usual anticipation of the next mission was notably absent. Rebecca and I have been tracking these trafficking operations for years. There are always more to uncover. Because of Sarah, Clara said softly, not a question, but a gentle acknowledgement of the driving force behind his work. Samuel nodded, surprised by how natural it felt to hear Clara speak his sister's name, a name he rarely spoke aloud himself, the wound still too raw even after 8 years. She was 19. He found himself saying words he had shared with few others. Beautiful, headstrong, determined to make her own way after our parents died. I was fighting in Virginia, unable to protect her. The familiar pain constricted his chest as he continued. By the time I returned, she had fallen prey to men who trafficked young women to mining camps in frontier towns. I found her too late, already buried in an unmarked grave behind a brothel in Denver. Clara's hand covered his on the railing, a simple gesture of compassion that somehow made the burden of memory lighter. You've been hunting these men ever since, she concluded, understanding the depth of his mission in a way few could. Yes, Samuel acknowledged. Sometimes officially, sometimes not. Bringing down the Blackwoods operation is the most significant success we've had. He paused, the realization striking him anew. Perhaps the closest I'll come to justice for Sarah. Clara's fingers tightened briefly around his. And once justice is done, what then? The question resonated deeply, echoing her earlier query to James about identity beyond the mission. Who was Samuel Foster without his pursuit of Sarah's traffickers? What remained when vengeance and justice no longer consumed his every waking moment? I don't know, he admitted. I haven't thought beyond the next case in a very long time. Clara studied him, her expression thoughtful. Perhaps it's time you did. Before Samuel could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. Rebecca appeared on the path leading to the cabin, riding a bay mare and leading a second horse, Samuel's mount, for the journey to the stagecoach station. Time to go, Rebecca called as she approached. Jenkins is already at the station and the stage leaves in an hour. Clara withdrew her hand from Samuel's, the moment of intimacy giving way to the practicalities of departure. I'll get my shawl, she said. I'm riding with you to town to see Jenkins off. As she disappeared inside, Rebecca dismounted, leading the horses to the hitching post. Everything all right? She asked, noting Samuel's pensive expression. Fine, he replied automatically. Rebecca's knowing look suggested she wasn't convinced, but chose not to press. James is at the station too, she informed him. Says he wants to speak with you before we leave. Samuel nodded, wondering what Clara's husband could possibly have to say to him that hadn't already been communicated through silent acknowledgments and careful distance over the past week. Clara reappeared, shawl draped around her shoulders, a small bag in hand. Some extra supplies for the journey, she explained, securing it to Samuel's saddle. The ride to town passed mostly in silence, each rider absorbed in private thoughts. Willow Creek appeared different somehow, as they approached, still worn and weathered, but with a new energy evident in the increased activity on the streets. The newly painted sign outside what had been the Rusty Nail. Now under new management, the general store reopened under the temporary supervision of a town council member. At the stagecoach station, Jenkins waited on a bench, looking remarkably improved from the broken man they had rescued from the town hall basement. Still thin and bearing the marks of his ordeal, he nevertheless stood as they approached, offering Samuel his hand. Couldn't leave without thanking you properly, he said, his grip firm despite his weakened state. You saved my life, Foster. Won't forget it. Just doing my job, Samuel replied, the standard response feeling inadequate for the bond forged through shared danger and purpose. Jenkins smiled knowingly. Sure you were. His gaze moved to Clara. And you, Mrs. Winters. Without your care, I'd have been in no condition to testify. The Blackwoods would have gotten away with everything. Clara accepted his thanks with a gracious nod. You're the one facing them in court, Mr. Jenkins. That takes its own kind of courage. As they spoke, Samuel noticed James standing near the stagecoach, deep in conversation with Marshal Collins. The two men shook hands, then James turned, catching sight of Samuel and gesturing for him to join them. Excusing himself, Samuel approached, curiosity mingling with wariness. Winters, Marshal. Foster, Collins acknowledged with a respectful nod. Fine work on this case. Pinkerton should be proud. Thank you, sir. Samuel turned to James, waiting for whatever he had been summoned to hear. James glanced toward Clara, who was still engaged with Jenkins, before speaking. I wanted to thank you, he began, his tone formal but sincere, for protecting Clara when I couldn't, or chose not to. The admission that his absence had been at least partially a choice rather than a necessity clearly cost James something to voice aloud. She didn't need much protecting, Samuel replied honestly. She's stronger than either of us probably realized. A smile touched James's lips, recognition rather than surprise in his expression. Yes, she is. He hesitated, then continued with careful deliberation. Clara told me about your conversations, your time together these past weeks, about how you helped her find herself again after believing me dead. Samuel tensed slightly, uncertain where this was leading. She helped herself. I was just there. You were more than just there, James countered gently, and we both know it. A moment of silent acknowledgement passed between them, two men who under different circumstances might have been friends, rather than awkward participants in an emotional triangle neither had anticipated. I'm going to testify in Denver, James continued, then head east for a time. The marshals need information about similar operations in other territories. He glanced again toward Clara. She and I have agreed to give each other space, to figure out who we are now separately before deciding if there's still a we to salvage. Samuel absorbed this, careful to keep his expression neutral, despite the implications. Why are you telling me this? James met his gaze directly. Because you should know that whatever happens between Clara and me, whatever she decides, he paused, seeming to choose his next words with great care. She deserves someone who puts her first. Not a cause, not a mission, not even justice, however worthy those things might be. The statement hung between them, its significance unmistakable. Samuel recognized in James's words a reflection of his own internal conflict, the dedication to a mission that had defined him for so long versus the unexpected connection he had formed with Clara. You should know, James added, his voice lowering, that I won't contest whatever choice she makes. Her happiness matters more to me than my pride or expectations of how things should be. Before Samuel could formulate a response to this unexpected declaration, the stagecoach driver called for passengers to board. James extended his hand, a gesture of respect between equals. Safe journey, Foster. Samuel clasped the offered hand, finding a strange sense of connection with this man who had experienced his own version of death and resurrection. And to you, Winters. As they parted, Samuel returned to where Clara stood with Rebecca and Jenkins, the moment of departure upon them. Jenkins boarded first, assisted by the driver, followed by Rebecca, who gave Samuel a pointed look that suggested they would have much to discuss during their journey. Left momentarily alone with Clara, Samuel found himself at a loss for words, unusual for a man whose survival had often depended on quick thinking and verbal agility. So, Clara said, breaking the silence, Denver awaits. Clara, Samuel began, still unsure what he wanted to say, what he had the right to say given all that remained unresolved. She smiled, understanding in her